Good morning, everybody. I think we're good to go. Firstly, happy St. Bridget's Day, Lála Breda. It's the start of spring and a very good day, I think, to have a seminar. My name is Vaughan and I'm chairperson of the National Statistics Board. We have a full agenda today and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. I'm delighted that Minister Hildegarde Naughton could join us to open our seminar. Minister Naughton is Minister of State at the Department of the Taoiseach with special responsibility as the Government Chief Whip. And she's also Minister of State at the Department of Health with special responsibility for public health, well-being and the National Drug Strategy. So definitely busy portfolios. Just tell you a little bit about the Minister. She was elected to represent the Galway West constituency in the 2020 general election, having previously served as a senator. She has served on a number of Oireachtas committees, including the Future of Healthcare and on the Budgetary Scrutiny Committee. She was appointed as chair of the Communications, Climate Action and Environment Committee in 2016. Minister, you're very welcome, and I genuinely appreciate you taking the time, and I invite you to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone, and you're all very welcome to Dublin Castle, to the National Statistics Board seminar on the future of how censuses are conducted in Ireland. At the outset, I would like to thank Anne Vaughan, the board and the CSO for organising this seminar, and I very much look forward to hearing about the output of your discussions today. In a world of mis- and disinformation, we all need a trusted source of truth, which we can all rely on. The Central Statistics Office is that source. And as you know, amongst its most important work programme is the delivery of the census. It's an integral piece of work and one which captures an astonishing amount of information from more than 2 million households right across our state. Consider the breadth of the detail captured. At the conclusion of the census, the CSO knows the age, sex, ethnicity and religion, if any, of every person in the state. It knows where they live, with whom they share their home, whether they speak Irish or other languages, and if they hold down a job. But this isn't a case of the big brother watching. This information is not used to sell to advertisers for profit. As you know, its purpose is essential to plan for the provision of essential public services. Do you want to school? Census data will show the number and the age of children living in an area to determine if one is needed. Information on educational attainment and employment is used to map the most deprived parts of the country, giving planners the information needed to deliver these services. Are you concerned about a lack of public transport? The census analyses travel patterns to work, to school, or for leisure purposes, and captures whether buses, trains, dart, Lewis, bike, foot, or car is used as the primary mode of transport, helping to determine where this investment is needed. I could go on, but it's clear to see that the census is an essential tool for policymakers, business leaders, NGOs, community groups and many others to help deliver the services we need to ensure a good quality of life for all our citizens while fostering economic growth. Ensuring that we are capturing the correct information is among the reasons as to why this seminar today is so important. The National Statistics Board has responsibility to guide the broad strategic direction of the Central Statistics Office and to establish priorities for the development of official statistics in Ireland. In its most recent strategy, Quality Information for All, Numbers Matter, the NSB identified the need to explore approaches to census taking in Ireland. Today's seminar starts that conversation with stakeholders, expert users and interested parties on what census collection may look like in the future, taking into account all the broad and important uses the census plays in our society. There are many ideas for how we can enhance the census, including many that we will hear about here today. And I think it's worth stating that no decision has been made on these or what the future could look like. So I'll ask you all to engage openly and constructively in the discussions this morning. The environment in which the CSO operates is changing, and I understand that there are a series of challenges facing population statistics in the coming years, including an ever-increasing demand and requirement for new and more frequent data from Eurostat, the European Statistical Agency, and from users more generally. There are also the added challenges of declining response rates and the difficulty in counting hard-to-reach groups within society. As our society has evolved over the 180 years since the first great census of Ireland was carried out, so too has the census process, with the most recent example being the intention by the CSO to provide an online response for the first time in the Irish Census 2027. So we should always be open to further change, taking advantage of new technologies, the great strides the CSO has made in utilising administrative data, the increasing demands for more timely information, and how society itself is changing. So against this backdrop, I welcome you all here this morning to the seminar, which provides a really great opportunity to consider the role that the census plays and to begin that conversation on what the future could look like. So thank you very much for the invite here this morning. I unfortunately can't stay for the whole seminar, but I look forward to hearing the output of today's discussions. I have to go back to the Dáil as my role as Chief Whip, but I wish you every success, and thank you so much for inviting me. Go raibh míle maith againn.
Thanks very much, Minister. And as the Minister said, she has to leave shortly, but her officials are here. And I know as a previous official of many ministers, they look for their report backs. As the Minister said, the NSB, in its own strategy, in our own strategy, stated our intention to hold this seminar. And we're delighted that it's happening today. It's the start of a consultation process, and as the Minister said, I look forward to your engagement. We have planned the agenda to have plenty of time for interaction and for questions, and this will be facilitated by chairpersons of the three sessions. Ethna Fitzgerald will chair session 1, Martina Lawless will chair session 2, and both are fellow NSB members, and I'll chair session 3. We'll break for coffee at 11. Very important. And now just a few points on the seminar, and then we'll start. The presentations will be made available on our website, nsb.ie, in the next few days. The seminar is being recorded. Thanks very much, Dave. And the recording will also be put on the NSB website in the next few days. Now, don't worry if when you ask a question, you put your hand up, you won't be recorded, just the question. The Wi-Fi code was there and is there. Yep, there it is. That's the Wi-Fi code for Dublin Castle. And to facilitate asking questions, maybe if you're a little shy, we also are using Slido. And there's the details. So on your smart device, log into Slido, you see the code, and you're good to go. And then during the conference at any stage, you can just put up questions and people can like your questions or not, and the questions will come to the top. So we'll take a mixture of questions from Slido and the old-fashioned way. Please put your mobile on silent. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to Ethna. Thank you very much, to chair our first session and invite our CSO speakers to take their stand. Thank you very much.
Our first session will be presentations from the CSO. We're going to CSO census team. First of all, we're going to have Cormac Halpin, who is the person responsible for census outputs, and he's also going to talk us through the huge logistics involved in mounting the census. Then we'll have Tim Linehan, who will give a paper on the future of census taking. And finally, we will have Richie McMahon, who's the Assistant Director General with responsibility for the whole social statistics, household statistics and census area. This session will run until 11 o'clock, which is coffee time, which you'll look forward to. We expect to have about 20 minutes for questions. So as the presentations are going, if you want to think of your questions, what you want to ask. If we can't take all the questions in this session, there will be a wrap-up question session in session 3 at the end. So there'll be plenty of time to take your questions. So with that, I'd like to invite Cormac to present. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethna. I think I'm the first CSO speaker today, so on behalf of the organisation, I'd like to welcome you all. It's great to see so many people here that have an interest in the census. So I'm responsible for census outputs, which is effectively the part of the census after we get the forms back into our HQ in Swords, the processing of the data and the publication, which hopefully you would have seen some of last year. What I'm going to speak to you about today is a little look back, first of all, on the history of censuses in Ireland, to give a bit of context to today's presentations. The main focus of the presentation will be on Census 2022 as the most recent census that we've completed, really just to give you a sense of what's involved from undertaking a traditional census in Ireland. And then I'm going to briefly look at some high-level plans for Census 2027, and particularly how it's going to change compared with Census 2022. Okay, so the census in Ireland, I think, has got a long and mainly illustrious past. The first official complete census was undertaken in 1821. There were several attempts to count the population before that, either partial censuses or counts based on mathematical modelling, but that's the first official one that we recognised. The Minister mentioned the 1841 census, which has got the moniker Great. That's how we always refer to it in CSO. That's the first time that it kind of resembled the census as we know today, in that householders had an input in completing their census form. The first census then post-independence was in 1926, and I'm glad to report that the National Archives are busy working away with the intention of releasing the detailed information from that in 2 years' time, subject to the 100 years rule. The census became 5-yearly in 1951. The main reason for that was that the government at the time needed to get a better handle on population. The population then, as is today, was subject to migration flows that were quite pronounced in the context of the overall population. It's interesting to note that the census was postponed 4 times for very different reasons. In 1921, because of the War of Independence. In 1976, for financial reasons. In 2001, because of the foot and mouth disease. And in 2021, because of the COVID outbreak. And finally, just to note that there will be an online response option, as the Minister mentioned, for the first time in 2027, which I think is worth noting because it's a major historical departure. So that's obviously a very, very quick potted history of the census in Ireland, but there's a lot more information on our website and other sources if you're interested in that kind of thing. Okay, so coming on to the main part of the presentation, which is Census 2022, and certainly very fresh in my mind and some colleagues here, I think. So this just give you some context and background of how the census was run a couple of years ago. So the first thing to say was that it was de facto census. You mightn't be familiar with that phrase, but you're probably familiar with the concept of what it means. So effectively it means that everybody who was in the country on census night was required to have their information captured on a census form. I mention that because there are other ways of counting the population which will emerge over the course of today, but that's the one that people are very familiar with in Ireland and very bought into. We ran a traditional census. So a traditional census basically means that everybody in the country is required, or every household in the country is required to complete a census form. There's different ways of doing that. The way we did it in 2022 was that a set of enumerators went out and hand-delivered and collected paper forms. Other countries do it online, which is where we're going in 27, but effectively that means that it's a full enumeration of the country. The previous census took place in 2016, so 6 years previously. The census was due to take place in April 2021, but it was postponed due to the COVID outbreak. There was a government decision on foot of advice from CSO in late 2020 to do that. So the night of the census was rescheduled to the 3rd of April 2022, which is a date that's seared into a lot of our minds, I think, for eternity. And just to note in the historical context was that it was the 26th census since 1841, since the Great Census. And I think that's important to note, just in terms of the level of affinity and the historical resonance of the census for the Irish population. It's very, very well established, the way that we do the census in Ireland. Okay, I'm going to try and avoid as much census vernacular and acronyms as I can. I could do an hour-long presentation on census acronyms, but I'm going to try and avoid that as much as I can. So please, if I lapse into one, shout me down and tell me to explain it. The field operation is basically the process by which we deliver and collect the census forms and bring them back to our HQ in Swords. So in order to do that in 2022, we divided the country into over 5,000 enumeration areas. An enumeration area is basically an area containing a number of houses in which the enumerators are responsible for delivering and collecting those census forms. So on average, the enumerators are responsible for about 400 to 450 dwellings. So they're required to go knock on every door in their area, those 400 to 450 dwellings, make contact with the householder, establish whether the dwelling would be occupied on census night, deliver the census form, return after census night and collect the census form. So that's effectively the field operation. Sounds very simple, but at scale you can imagine there's a lot of complexity in it. For the most part, that involved the delivery and collection of a 24-page household form, which most of you probably would have seen around the time of the census 2 years ago. That's got 24 pages. It's got room for 6 people, 3 pages of questions per person. There was a slight difference for communal establishments. So communal establishments are managed residential accommodation, hotels, guest houses, prisons, hospitals, those kind of setups. So for those, the enumerator would have made contact with the manager of the communal establishment and delivered what's called a listing form. So this is effectively a form whereby the manager of the communal establishment can write down everybody's name that is in that communal establishment on census night, and everybody who's in that hotel or hospital gets an individual form, which is a smaller 4-page form, which they complete their census information in, give it back to the manager who then returns it to the enumerator. It's a major logistical operation. We think it's one of the biggest logistical operations that takes place in the state. You can imagine the scale of it, getting those forms from our HQ in Swords, over 3 million of them, to every single part of the country through our network of field staff and enumerators. So it's a really onerous operation, but you know, that's I suppose what you have to do in order to make sure that every single household is visited in order to get a census form. To run such a big operation, you need a lot of people to do it. So there's a huge recruitment operation takes place to facilitate the field operation. So in order to do it, we had to recruit around 5,600 temporary field staff. That was particularly challenging in 2022 because the labour market then, as it is now, is extremely tight. So we were competing with a lot of other organisations, both public sector colleagues and private sector organisations. We recruited about 5,100 enumerators, around 400 field supervisors who were responsible for managing those enumerators, about 40 regional supervisors who were in charge of an area approximate to the size of a county, and 6 census liaison officers who were the top of the field operation and sat with us in our HQ in Swords. In order to do that, we conducted around 11,000 interviews, some of those by some colleagues that are here today to recruit the top level of that field staff, but most of them in a kind of a pyramid structure. We recruited people who then went on to recruit their own staff. So again, a major operation there, and there was 262 interview boards, each of you who undertook several stages or days of interviews. We had bespoke payment arrangements for our enumerators, so they don't get paid like regular civil servants do. They get paid on what we refer to as a piecemeal basis. So effectively, they get paid depending on the number of forms that they deliver and collect to the households in their areas. So that required a major operation with the National Shared Services Office to make sure that we set those up, to make sure that the enumerators were paid on time, because not paying enumerators on time is a sure death knell for the census, so it's really important that was done. And training is critical as well. So it's really important that we train all of our field staff in a uniform way so that the census is undertaken in the same way in every single enumeration area in the country. And that's important for transparency as well. So we can say, this is how we approach the census, this is how everybody was trained, and this is the results that come back when we publish our population count at the end of it. So moving on then just to give a little bit more information about the data collection. So one of the main changes that we introduced for Census 2022, and I think this is with a nod to where we're going with 2027, is that we introduced a new smartphone application for our enumerators. So every enumerator was given a smartphone, and every member of field staff indeed was given a smartphone in 2022. And we developed an application that sat on that smartphone by which they recorded every interaction that they had with the households in their area. So, you know, everything from a dog bite, of which there are quite a few, down to, you know, successful delivery, successful collection of a form, declaring a dwelling to be vacant. It was a real advance for us because, you know, by collecting that information on a smartphone, it generated a huge amount of management information for us in Census HQ, as well as for our field staff. So it allowed us to identify areas that might be lagging behind, where we might need additional resources to assist enumerators in difficult to complete areas. That replaced the paper book that we had in 2016. So it was a real advancement for us and a real change compared to previous censuses. And just looking forward again to 2027, so the first interface that most people would have with the census in a census year is when their enumerator knocks on their door. And we believe that that's a really big contributor to the high response rates that we get in Ireland, that every single door gets knocked upon. That's going to change in 2027, which I'll come on to. But our enumerators are almost like a jack of all trades. They not only deliver and collect the forms, they're there to answer questions for people as well about how do you complete the form. They make contact about when's an appropriate time for people to be at home to collect the form and so on. We did have a call centre, both a telephone one and a web-based support. Again, that's going to be more and more important as we move towards 2027, and a major multimedia national publicity campaign. So, that's about kind of educating people, informing people about the census. A lot of people kind of think we have to do the census, we might get prosecuted, but we try to put more of the emphasis on the reason that we do the census, the good that it delivers to the country. You would have seen Eileen there in the audience and myself maybe doing a lot of media interviews around the time. And from our perspective, it's gratifying to do that because, there is a lot of public interest, which harks back to what I said about the affinity that the public has with the census. That's something that's going to become more important in time as we move away from the model whereby enumerators are knocking on the door. I am at heart a statistician, so it wouldn't be a statistical presentation without some numbers, but they're fairly pain-free, hopefully. We visited about 2.1 million dwellings, so every residential dwelling in the country would have knocked on their door in 2022. That generated 9 million of those smartphone interactions that I mentioned. This is really just to give you a bit of context about the scale of the operation again. We delivered 1.9 million of the forms. We collected 1.7 million. There's a little bit of a disconnect there because often when you deliver a form, you don't connect it because people might be away on census night, or enumerators deliver a form to a dwelling that turns out to be vacant. So we estimate that about 96% of the dwellings that were occupied on census night returned a form, which is a very impressive figure to come back, and again, testament to the Irish public's buy into the census. But again, the statistician in me says, what about that 4%? So I'll come back to that 4% in a subsequent slide. Okay, after people give their form back to their enumerator, for a lot of people that ends their interest in the census for another 5 years. But for us, it's just handing the baton on to the next stage, the next major part of the operation, which is processing. So processing effectively is the capture of the handwritten data off the census forms and the transfer of them into a digital database to allow us to produce our census results. Again, sounds quite simple, but you could write a book about everything that goes on in it. In order to do that, we had to procure a partner to help us build the processing system. We did that in 2019 in a major piece of procurement. Their requirement was to design and print the census forms, and then the most important thing, to design, print, build and support the forms processing system. The forms, we got them back in to our HQ in Swords in May of 2022. We then began processing them, capturing that data, scanning them, reading the information, repairing it, coding it. That took place between May of 2022 and February of last year. Again, a major requirement in terms of staffing. So we had over 100 staff employed for the duration of that operation. And again, just a little bit of the scale of it, over 40 million pages were scanned, repaired and coded in order to generate the outputs database. Okay, you're going to hear a lot today about administrative data. So just up front, what is administrative data? It's effectively data that's generated primarily in other government departments and agencies in the course of their day-to-day business. So the Department of Social Protection, for example, would generate a lot of administrative data in the administration of their various payment schemes, and the Department of Education, in enrolling students and pupils. So under the Statistics Act 1993, CSO has privileged use of that data, which we do in compliance with GDPR. It's a really powerful source of statistical data for the CSO, and it's one that's being increasingly used across many statistical domains within the CSO. So in the context of Census 2022, administrative data was used in several different ways. It was used, coming back to that 4%, for a lot of that 4%, we used administrative data. So we knew that dwellings were occupied for a lot of those 4%, but the enumerators could not get census forms back. So we turned to our administrative data, and we could generate households using that administrative data. And we used those households to put them in to the dwellings that we couldn't get a census form back for. So, that gave us great confidence because that administrative data is of high quality. Those government schemes are regularly administered. So it's very reliable that those people are associated with those dwellings in most of those cases. So, the alternative to that is kind of moving into guesswork about how many people are in there, or using kind of averages and imputation. So it's a really powerful source of data to maintain the quality of the census data. We also use it to add young children. So the amateur psychologists among you might have a view on this, but there's an international phenomenon in census taking whereby a lot of people miss out young children and babies on their census form, which, as somebody who had a young baby at the time of the 2016 census, is a bit of a strange one to me. They're, I think, the first person in our form at the time. but it's something that's an international phenomenon. So again, through our privileged access to the birth register in this case, we could add those young children that were missed from the census forms to give a more complete count. So, you can imagine that young children are really important for things like planning for schools. In 5 years' time, those young children will be of school-going age. So it's really important that we have that information in the census. Attribute coverage is something we used it for as well. So attributes effectively are the questions in the census form. So, when people are missing or don't respond to the census, in case of that 4%, or people just not answering certain questions, we get gaps and not stated values on the census. So where those attributes exist in administrative data, we can add them back into the census. So something like country of citizenship is present in Department of Social Protection data, and we can use information about whether people rent their data from the Residential Tenancies Board. So, again, that increases the quality of the census, and the alternative for us would be kind of educated guesswork or leaving a blank in the outputs. And finally, we brought in a concept called occupancy modelling. So there was a relatively small proportion of dwellings where we just didn't know, often apartments where numerator didn't know if the dwelling was occupied or not on census night. So what we did then, again, we used our privileged access to utility data in this case, so data like ESB data, to see if the pattern of electricity usage in those dwellings was consistent with those dwellings being occupied. And if it was, we put people into that dwelling. So again, that's something that, it's the administrative data improves the quality of the census data compared to what the alternative might have been. And you'll hear a lot more about administrative data and the potential future use of it in the census. But I suppose the point that I want to make is it's already a real part of the census, and that's not going to change going forward. Okay, the final stage of Census 2022 is the one that we're still in at the moment, and we actually have a publication coming out in an hour and 15 minutes, so I'm definitely keen to get finished up in time to see how that goes. Dissemination is the publication of the results. There were several different stages to that last year, but it actually began in 2022, the first of which was a preliminary population count, which we released in 2022. This is based on kind of manual summary counts by the enumerators in the field. The reason we published that is that it's very soon after the night of the census. It's 3 months after the census. We think it's internationally unique, so it's something we're very proud of. We feel like it's giving back to the public, that they've taken the time to complete the census forms, and we have the capacity within 3 months of the census to give them back census information, so we do that. And most importantly, it's historically very, very close to the official results that comes out a year later, which was the case, thankfully, last year as well. After the data has been processed and the census file is finalised, we produce our detailed summary publication, which went out in May of last year. So we do a kind of an interpretive publication whereby we put text and visualizations around the census data, which we think is important to make it as comprehensible as possible to as many people as possible. We also release hundreds of statistical tables as well for maybe more advanced data users. Following that, we produced 7 thematic releases in 2023 and accompanying statistical tables, all of which are available on our website. We produced the small area population statistics, which to me are the crown jewels of census. So if you're not familiar with the small area population statistics, they're kind of small neighbourhood statistics. So it allows you to get a whole range of information, the age profile, how people commute to work, the industries and occupations people work in, whether there's disabilities, to areas proximate to about 100 dwellings or so. So that could encompass your townlands, your housing estate, your street, and it can be used for a vast range of different purposes, like local groups might use it to campaign for funding. You could look at it if you're considering buying a house in the area. Local sports clubs could look at their catchment area. So it's widely used by all sectors of society. We produce our commuting microdata set POWSCOR, which is used by I think every local authority in the country in their county development plan to look at stuff like traffic management, infrastructural development. And finally, just to mention, we introduced a new concept of towns. I could give an hour-long presentation of towns here alone. Some people think that towns are kind of static entities. They're not. They grow, change, and evolve over time. So we introduced these built-up areas in conjunction with the Department of Housing and Tailteann Éireann to try and reflect the evolution of towns as they grow over time, and those boundaries kind of changing and flexing over time as well. Again, lots more information on our website. Okay, just some reflections then on Census 2022, just to kind of tee up Tim's conversation and where we're going with the rest of today. So as I've stressed several times, the public cooperation comparatively remained very, very high. Often a lot of our work during the time of the field operation is concentrating on that 4%, the more difficult cases. But overwhelmingly, public cooperation is very, very high, and there's real public buy-in to the concept of the census. And that allows us to produce a real high-quality data set to facilitate our publications. I'm not going to stand up here and blow our own trumpet, but please go onto our website and look at the range of data that we have available. One of the real strengths of census data is cross-tabulation, which is the census vernacular alert. Basically, that means that you can look at every every variable in the context of every other variable. So you could look at, for example, disability. So you look at the age profile of people who are disabled, whether they're at work, where they live in the country. You can do that for every different variable in the census. It's an infinite number of combinations, and it really allows people across all different sectors of society and all users to kind of get to the heart of what they need from the census data. As I mentioned, the low-level geography is really important. I think Martin later on is going to talk about that from the Pobal perspective in terms of the deprivation index. But all different ranges of planners and resource allocators use census data down to a low level. There was a really high level of public interest in the results. Now, it's not always right to conflate media interest with public interest, but we were bowled over, particularly the release of the summary publication last May about the level of media interest. We actually got a live blog in the Irish Times, which I think, to my knowledge, had been the preserve of Premier League games and Six Nations games. For a statistical office to get that was really edifying. But again, huge amount of interest. Podcasts, new media, really, really good from our perspective. So, that was maintained throughout the rest of the year with all the different thematic publications. So, again, to reflect the interest the public has in the census. And finally, without wanting to labour the point, that historical connection that the census is so well established. And you might be familiar with the time capsule that we introduced to the census last year, which was an optional space on the census page for people to write in messages that'll be locked away for their descendants in 100 years' time. That really generated a lot of kind of social media buzz and interest in the census. I often get asked what was in those time capsules, but we don't know no more than anybody else does. From a statistical perspective, they're almost the least interesting part of the processing. So we didn't actually look at them other than just capturing the information, the number that we got. It's going to be the privilege of our descendants in 100 years' time, or 98 years' time now, to get to look at those. And I think that'll be really interesting when they come out. Not that I'll be around to see it, unfortunately. So then, just some other reflections. So that 4%, it's relatively small. You might kind of think, why are you worrying about that? I suppose the context is that it's increasing every time we do a census, the level of non-response. Lots of different reasons for this, and it's something we also see in our household surveys. Society is changing. It's not the same society that it was 20, 30 years ago. People are busy. People live in gated communities and apartments which are difficult to access. So, that 4% was much less in 2016 and 2011. The way that it's going and increasing, it's very likely it's going to increase again in 2027. So that's something we need to be conscious of as we move forward. Unfortunately, a lot of that non-response is concentrated in deprived areas, and often those areas are areas that need census data to the greatest extent. So again, that's something that we need to concentrate on and do as much as we can, but be cognizant that society is changing. The census only takes place every 5 years or 6 years in the last iteration. But the demand, as you're going to hear from Tim, for census data on a more regular basis is increasing on an international basis and on a national basis. It would be great if we could do the census every year. I'm looking at the scales from my colleagues in census here who are going, no, it wouldn't. But it's a major logistical operation, and it's only possible, to do it every 5 years. But the demand is increasing all the time for more regular census data at a low level of geography. It's increasingly difficult to enumerate smaller population cohorts. The demand for producing information on smaller population cohorts is increasing as well, often because those smaller population cohorts can be concentrated in those more relatively deprived areas, and often we have to develop more bespoke enumeration procedures to ensure that we get good coverage in those smaller population cohorts. And finally, as I mentioned, recruitment is increasingly challenging, particularly when there's tight labour markets, and it's a big operation to go from kind of 0 to 5,600 people within the course of a year. So that's always something that's difficult, but it's been managed very well by my colleagues in census recruitment to date. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Census 2027 because it's still 3 years away. What I really want to just give you is a flavour of how it's going to change. So the change that's all other changes are going to flow from is that we're going to offer an online response option. So in 2027, you will have the opportunity to complete the census form on your mobile phone, your tablet, your desktop, whatever new technologies exist in 3 years' time. But you will also have the option to complete it on a paper form as well. So for people who can't complete their census form online, they will have the opportunity to complete the paper form. For us, that means that we're running kind of like a dual operation. We'll have to do everything we did previously in terms of the paper forms, but also introduce this new mode of completing it. That entails a change field operation. So previously, as I said, the first time that you would have had contact with the census was a numerator knocking on your door. In 2027, the first contact you're going to have with the census is going to be a mail shot coming through your door, inviting you to log onto a website put in your access code and complete your census form. So very, very different. You will also have the opportunity to request a paper form be delivered to you. So that's a major change in how the field operation is conducted. As I said, the enumerator to date has been the first line of support. That will be different in 2027. We still will have enumerators, I want to stress that, but their main focus will be non-response follow-up. So if a form isn't completed at a certain address, enumerators will go to that address to try and get the form back. So, it's very, very important and incumbent upon us to make sure that all the support is there, but in different formats. So the call centre, the online help will be much more pronounced this time round. The profile of recruitment and staffing will be very different as well. So we won't be hiring as many enumerators, or the growth in enumerators won't be the case that it would have been in previous censuses, but we will need to staff up the call centre, the online help and so on. We'll also need the major publicity campaign as well. Again, not just to inform people the census is taking place, but to educate them about how they can do it differently and how it's going to change. And IT systems testing and security. As we go online, obviously we're introducing new IT systems and new security as well. People rightly will want guarantees that their data is secure and safe. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that that is the case, that their data is perfectly safe with CSO, and that takes a lot of testing, a lot of development, which is well underway at the moment by my colleagues working in Census IT. Just a couple of final ones then on the data side of things. So we are moving from the de facto to usual residence census. So this is a major change. The concept of where you were in census night is moving away to where you usually live. Now that's something that we need to educate the public on. This is how most censuses are done across most of the world. So something like if you're in your granny's house in Donegal, but you usually live in Cork, previously you would have completed the census form in your granny's house on census night. This time round you'll be completing at your usual residence in Cork. So that needs to change. In our messaging. But it also makes the data more consistent with administrative data, most of which is on a usual residence basis because we don't get administrative data every day of the year. There'll also be an implication for the data that we publish. So the headline population figure from 2027 will most likely be on a usual residence basis. We can produce Census 2022 data on a usual residence basis, but a lot of the aggregates that people will be familiar with, such as the population total, that 5.15 million is de facto. So again, we're going to have to make people aware that the basis on which the population is counted is changing. There's a process underway at the moment. There's actually a meeting next week of the Census Advisory Group, of which some of you here might be members, to recommend which questions we're going to test in a pilot in September of this year, with a view to including them on Census 2027. So as ever, as is the case between 16 and 22, there's a lot of potential changes. So some of the areas that might be tested in the pilot, including a new question on gender, on sexual orientation, on parking, on mental health. So lots of different new areas coming onto the census form potentially for 2027. The use of administrative data is not going to go away. It's going to increase, and I think that's a good thing for all the reasons that I referenced earlier on. It improves the quality of census data and gives us a more complete count and the confidence in the data that we published. And finally, as good and all as administrative data is, it doesn't cover everything. So something like religion, speaking Irish language, ethnic group and background isn't in any government database. So as the level of non-response might tend to increase, CSO has the option of leaving those not stated values in or doing something in terms of imputation, which a lot of our international colleagues do. It's to use other data within the census to try and give a best guess about what somebody's religion might be. So it's not ideal, but the alternative is to leave more and more of those blanks, which reduces the quality of the data. So again, that's something that hasn't been decided, but it's something that we need to consider and might impact the data that you see after 2027. Okay, that's it from me. Deep breath. I just wanted to leave it on this slide here and to emphasise the value of the census. So there's lots of your own organisations there. They're mainly public sector type organisations. There's lots of other types of organisations, private sector organisations that use the census data. They tend to use it more passively. We tend to interact more with public sector organisations, which is why I put them up there. Private individuals, community groups, charities. The range of use of census data is huge. We're very, very conscious of that in CSO. And that's partially why we want to be here today, is to start the conversation with you, the users, to outline to you some of the changing environment that's coming out, but also to see how we can meet as best we can as part of this consultation, your needs and your demands going forward. So I'll pause there and let Tim take up the next part of the story. Thanks very much.
Hello everyone. Tim Linehan here from the Central Statistics Office, and thanks to Cormac there for an excellent summary of the census. Now, I'm from the Life Event and Demography Division, so we handle the kind of non-census population estimates, and we also cover vital statistics. But today what we're going to be talking about is the options for how the future of how censuses are conducted in Ireland. So we're talking medium to long term here, I suppose, for starters. Now, I suppose, firstly, we'll begin by really an overview of our current CSO population statistics. And the next thing is we're going to discuss are the current and emerging challenges that are facing population statistics and why we are exploring new options. And then we're actually going to discuss in detail the potential approaches to addressing these challenges. In other words, the products that we have either developed or looking into developing to address the challenges in population statistics. Now, in terms of our current population statistics, firstly, we have the traditional 5-year census. And as we can see from Cormac's wonderful presentation, the word traditional covers a lot of technology. So this does cover a lot of new developments, but it's the classic 5-year census, and it will be taking place in 2027 with the online option. And then we have our annual population estimates. Now, this is the CSO's product where, in effect, we combine census data, our annual vital statistics data, and labour force survey information and migration to create rolling annual population estimates. So these are the annual, usually resident populations that are published on our website. And we'll be talking a bit about today that the CSO has developed and published a frontier product for population estimates exclusively from administrative data. Now, this is called IPEDS, so we'll be hearing the word IPEDS a fair bit. It's a bit of a long acronym, personally, but it's a nice one. And it's Irish Population Estimates from Administrative Data Sources. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. And we will be discussing this in further detail. So, we can see the 3 products. We have Census 22 and 27. So these are, again, traditional censuses. And these are based on enumeration, so we're trying to count the entire population. We have IPEDS, so again, the population estimates from administrative data. And we have our annual population estimates, where again, we combine census, vital statistics, and labour force survey information to produce annual population estimates. Now, we also have current and emerging challenges, and we actually have quite a few of them. But it really can be summarised that we are facing requirements in particular for more frequent data. And these challenges, these requirements are emerging at both an EU level and at a national level. And we'll discuss these in detail, but I suppose one thing to note is there's a EU regulation that's expected to come into effect in 2026. It's called European Statistics on Population, or ESOP. And you could almost say if it's implemented in its full form, it'll be magnificent from a user's point of view. It would be the Palace of Versailles of population statistics. But Eurostat have a habit of kind of specifying in poetry, but the CSO has to implement in prose. So we have to develop products in turn that actually meet these demands. So that's why the word ESOP, it represents significant opportunities, but also significant challenges, and it drives a lot of our response. And I suppose really, to be honest, the current approaches will not meet these regulatory requirements, especially in terms of frequency. And we'll go into that in further detail. Now, of course, there's the other challenges Cormac outlined, which is primary data collection is becoming more difficult and response rates are under pressure. And that's not just in Ireland, that's internationally. People in general, it's harder to get people's attention. Now, in terms of the new EU regulation, we call it ESOP, so it's commencing in 2026. Now, again, it will significantly, dare I say dramatically, increase EU reporting requirements. So, in effect, really, it requires, in its current form, the kind of level of detail you'd associate with a 5-year census. It actually wants this kind of data, in a lot of cases, on an annual basis. And not only are there very big requirements on an annual basis under ESOP, but also there will be even more detailed requirements for 3 years, years 1, 5, and 8 of a 10-year cycle. So, we publish a census on year 1 and year 6, but there will be a requirement for years 1, 5, and 8. And unfortunately, the current approach to census taking can't meet these requirements. And we need a new solution. Now, IPEDS, as we mentioned earlier, will be a key element of meeting these EU requirements. But of course, we have significant challenges beyond EU regulatory requirements as well. So, one of the things is that people want more frequent national attribute data. Now, by attribute data, we're covering topics such as religion, socioeconomic status, carer status, commuting patterns. And this is the type of information that's only available on a 5-year basis with the census. But information of this type is becoming ever more sought, so we will need to produce this type of information more frequently. And how do we meet this demand? And also, there are falling response rates in official statistics, especially among certain cohorts. So, gated communities, it can be harder to get enumerators and CSO staff into the gated communities. We have apartment blocks, where again you've the spectacle of a CSO staff sneaking around the building like the Pink Panther to try to, that can become difficult. And then we have hard to reach groups. So it's to be aware of all these issues. And of course, we have ongoing cost and logistical challenges. And this is international. This is really just, it's a phenomenon of official statistics in general. So I suppose really in terms of meeting emerging demands, the considerations. Firstly, we know that IPEDS is a key way to meet the EU regulatory requirements, and it will be carried out on an annual basis. But the demands go beyond the EU requirements, in particular regarding attribute data. So IPEDS on its own does need supplementary approaches. Now, one of the biggest questions is the traditional census. How often? Longer term, a question could emerge that whether we need a traditional census in the long run if IPEDS plus a supplementary product, such as the Irish Community Survey, which we will be discussing, evolves. But certainly there is a question of how frequently we will be carrying out the traditional census in future. And one other item then, which we'll be discussing today, is a potential approach called the Irish Community Survey. And this would be a large-scale and mandatory household survey, which would be designed to produce attribute data more frequently than the traditional census. So it's similar to the American Community Survey, which is a long-term American US Census Bureau product for producing attribute data. Now, firstly, the traditional census. And as Cormac has outlined, it really is the crown jewel of official statistics, with its ability to produce and collect immense amount of statistics at all geographical levels and cross-tabulations. And also, one of the key values of the census is its ability to capture data that is not captured via administrative data. So, for example, we can capture all kinds of attribute information on religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, carer status, commuting patterns, information that it's not possible to capture via any administrative data source. And, of course, we say traditional, but it does cover all the new collection modes and all the innovations in the census, such as the use of administrative data. Now, the good news is, in the years ending in a 1, which is we call the decennial or once-a-decade requirement, the traditional census meets the ESOP regulatory requirements. So the EU have quite a lot of requirements for year 1 of a 10-year cycle, and the traditional census would meet those requirements. And you would need more than IPEDS to meet the requirements in that year. So, in short, if we want to meet the big European requirements for the once every 10 years in the first year of a 10-year period, so we'd be looking at 2031 here, we need either a traditional census or IPEDS plus an Irish Community Survey. Now, we'll talk a bit now about IPEDS. Now, again, it's the population estimates from administrative data sources. And a key idea with IPEDS is that it uses pseudonymized administrative data. In other words, the CSO, we take the confidentiality of the data very seriously. And IPEDS does not use any direct identifiers, and it's set up under a very rigorous data office or CSO data office approved approach. And the idea really is, it's a CSO approach to producing annual population estimates. Now, we've already had 2 rounds of it. The first one covered reference year 2020, and the second round covered reference year 2021, and we will be issuing a 3rd round of IPEDS this year. And it also incorporates geographical information in the form of air codes to allow for statistics at low geographical areas. Now, one thing to note about IPEDS is that as a frontier release, it is ever evolving. So it's really a means for producing annual population estimates. We use administrative data. It may be possible to produce sub-annual frequencies of publication for IPEDS in the future. But again, it's still in development. And one thing about IPEDS is, there are people who will not interact with the CSO, but the vast majority of people do interact with the state. So IPEDS does have a power for capturing hard-to-reach groups. Now, the approach in IPEDS is called Signs of Life, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on it later. But the one thing to know about IPEDS is that at the moment it can produce pretty good individual population estimates down to small geographical areas, but it currently isn't able to produce household level statistics, but we are working on developing these. So again, that's something that will be developed. And it's really a function, again, of the two key quality drivers are PPSN and air code coverage levels. And under the National Data Infrastructure, there's an ongoing drive to improve PPSN coverage, and there's an ongoing drive to cover air code or the geolocation. So as long as these continue to improve, and we in the CSO are also working on improving air code coverage, we will be able to address the household statistics question. So, as we know it, IPEDS is what's called a signs of life-based approach. And all statistics in IPEDS are usually resident. So it's not de facto, it's usually resident because we're using administrative data to work out if people have basically been in the country in the reference period. And it's a rules-based approach for measuring usually resident populations. And again, we've had 2 rounds of it released, IPEDS 2020 and IPEDS 2021. And IPEDS 21 links around 20 pseudonymized administrative data sets, including revenue, social welfare, education, and it's a mix of monthly and annual data sets. And once again, it's pseudonymized. The IPEDS team are not working with names, we're not working with direct identifiers, we're using the CSO's very well developed pseudonymized architecture to produce these statistics. So there's very high levels of data protection and matches because we're using the CSO's own pseudonymous but direct identifier is of very high quality. So then what we do is we put together people in all these data sets and in effect we look at, based on our rules, were they usually resident in the country in the reference period. So we combine quite a few different data sources. So for children, we look at education data sets, health data sets. For students, we look at the Higher Education Authority data sets. And for employers, we look at social protection and revenue data sets. And we also then have a couple of data sets which we don't use to determine if people are in the country or not, but we use them to determine air code information because we need to know where people are as well. And then what we do is we apply our rules to work out if people were usually resident in the country. And then we produce IPEDS estimates for April of the reference year. So the results for 2020, a usually resident population of 5.2 million. And the results for April 21 were a usually resident population of 5.28 million. Now, these are pretty close to the census. In fact, they're remarkably close. But we're able to produce statistics on age, sex, different geographical distributions, and also we're able to tell people their economic sectors that they work in and the principal economic status. So we can produce quite a bit of information. But the one thing to note is improving air code coverage will lead to more detailed geographical statistics, and it will also allow us to produce more accurate statistics on households. Because if we need to know people, how their living arrangements, we need to know where they live. So we need to know the most timely air code information or geolocation information on people. And one thing to note as well is our IPEDS team, that each IPEDS iteration has increased the rate of individual air codes. So what happens is that, in effect, originally, the first iteration got around 65% used individual air codes were found, but we're up to the mid-80s now. So to note that IPEDS is continuing to evolve and is continuing to improve. Now, in terms of the current variables that are available, we have sex, age, nationality, NACE sector, and principal economic status. Then we have our proposed IPEDS variables of marital status, household composition, and household size. Now, these are also going to be sought by the European Union under the ESOP regulation. And in terms of geography, we can produce state-level statistics, we can produce local authority, so equivalent to county council. We can also produce for all the local electoral areas in the country. And we're currently doing test statistics on electoral divisions, so the 3,400 or so electoral divisions. But again, the more timely air codes and the greater the coverage of air codes we have, the greater the level of geographical detail we'll be able to produce in IPEDS. And in terms of our level geographies, we're able to produce the statistics, for example, for Clane and Kildare. And we are also able to produce, say, the average age by electoral division. So just to note, we can see there's quite a lot of electoral divisions. I think it's around 3,400, and we can produce detailed statistics. Now, in terms of planned improvements, as it is an evolving process, we're developing tools to increase the coverage and the timeliness of the individual air codes. So again, that's the National Geolocation ID, which will allow more accurate statistics at lower geographies, such as electoral division and census small area in the long run. And this is particularly important for highly mobile elements of the population, such as college students, because we want to get the air code associated, say, with people living in college, rather than the residents' information, say, with their homes, for example, which could be in different areas. And also, using more timely geolocation data will allow us to produce more accurate household composition statistics. Because if we know where people are, we can work out their living arrangements. Now, in terms of the Irish Community Survey, now this is a proposal, but the idea is that it will be based on the United States American Community Survey as an annual and multi-annual household survey. And as we note, administrative data can't capture attribute data, but attribute data is very important to the CSO and it's very important to our users. So the idea really is that the Irish Community Survey could be used with IPEDs to form the basis of population statistics. So how would it work? At its simplest, it would involve the monthly and annual surveying of households and communal establishments, and we would produce annual outputs, which would be normally at a national level, and multi-annual outputs where, because we've pooled several years of respondents, we could produce statistics for small areas. And then ICS's real opportunity is it would allow for more frequent attribute data. So all the social variables which we get every 5 years, we would now have an opportunity to get them at certain levels of detail on an annual basis. Now the first thing though is, because a question will come up, it's a survey, and response rates would be the first question I think a lot of people would ask. The ICS would need to be a mandatory survey, and this would require legislation. We're going on the example of the Americans here, where they get a roughly 95–96% response rate, but it does require mandatory surveys. So in many ways, the ICS would be more like a census than a survey in terms of the legal enforcement. Also, one of the challenges is that it would have to adapt to Irish demographic and population changes. For example, people may be less likely over time to cooperate in general with data collection. Now, one thing to note in the United States, and the ICS, the American Community Survey, had a very long development process, but a key element was engaging with stakeholder groups. This was to ensure cooperation and also to increase awareness so that people are aware that there is this survey, it's important, the information in the survey is important. And again, the public awareness of the benefits would be critical to success. But of course, the one thing we would have to highlight is there would be significant cost and logistic challenges to running an Irish Community Survey. So again, we see that there are several potential options. We have IPEDs, we have an Irish Community Survey, and we have the traditional census. And I suppose, and this is just something to open to everyone here because it's the consultation, and we're here to listen, and there's possible options. And I suppose one other thing we have to emphasise is we are really talking about post-2031 here. And one of the things is that because of the fact that we have a decennial requirement and we'll have detailed statistics, is that we'll be very likely looking at a 2031 census on traditional lines. So again, we are taking the long-term time view here. But again, the possible options are a 5-yearly traditional census plus IPEDs, a 10-yearly traditional census plus IPEDs, a 10-yearly census plus IPEDs plus an Irish Community Survey, or we could be looking at IPEDs plus an Irish Community Survey. And again, we're looking beyond 2031 here, but these are the examples of the potential options. So it's long-term planning, but the implementations of these options would involve long planning processes in order to be successful. So again, look, it's the importance here of the public consultation that we can just kind of discuss and offer and consider the options. So, by way of conclusion, we have numerous potential options for post-2031 to meet the growing requirements both at a national level and at an EU level for our own population statistics. And of course, the value of official statistics is increasing. And in particular, though, what we need is more frequent statistics. And that's been driven by the EU, and it's a positive development. But it also is something that's important to our users and to ourselves. And then the traditional census, IPEDS and the ICS all have strengths and challenges. And again, we'll probably be looking at the possibility of combining multiple options. But one thing to note is that certainly IPEDS will be necessary to meet at least some of the annual EU requirements. And finally, the CSO is here to listen. So thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, and it's great to see you all here today, and we really do appreciate you coming along. I'm Richie McMahon. I've been head of social and demographic statistics in the CSO for the past 10 years, and that period actually spans 4 censuses. So I came in at the tail end of the 2011 census, then we had the no change census of 2016, the recent census of 22, and we're heavily involved in the preparations for the 2027 online census. So I'm just going to give you a recap of why we're here, and also to give my reflections on CSO and the census during my time here, and to also just to kind of reiterate what Tim and Cormac have been saying about the changing landscape for demographic statistics, and also how the traditional census is already evolving. And I'll then look ahead to the future options for consideration, and just tell you a little bit about the public consultation which we're going to undertake. And this is really the first step in that public consultation, and where we will take the views expressed today into account. So just to remind us, why are we here today? Well, I suppose it's really around the increased requirements for data on persons and households. Firstly, on a national level, there's increased demands coming constantly for more data on persons and households, more frequent data, more granular data. And secondly, as Tim mentioned, the new EU regulation, which effectively requires us to produce census-type data on an annual basis. And what's really clear is that the existing approach to the compilation of population statistics, the 5-yearly census with the intercensal estimates produced from a mixture of sources with like the labour force survey, the vital statistics and the benchmark census data, that will not be able to meet the future requirements. So what we're here to do is to kind of present options that will allow us to meet our requirements, and we're here to get your views. And as Tim said, we're here to listen. We've no fixed view on the way forward. So as Tim said, our sense is that we will be doing a traditional census in 2031. So we're really looking ahead well into the 2030s, but that is necessary given the level of planning and development that may be required for consideration of an option like an Irish community survey. I would also ask you if you could keep the discussion at a high level. We're looking at future approaches, so there's other mechanisms and other consultation processes for looking at the detail of what is included in the census questionnaires, what will be included, what's not included. So those discussions are happening, as Cormac said, in the census advisory group. So I suppose the real focus today is on the high level kind of strategic approach to demographic and population measurement in the years ahead. So just looking at CSO and the census, the CSO has a long and proud tradition of conducting censuses. We've been doing the 5-yearly census since 1951. And, you know, it's testament there's an awful lot of current and former census staff present, so we really do take great pride in doing censuses. If we look at the people of Ireland, there is that real affinity that Cormac spoke about with the census. There is that historical connection with the census. And our experience in CSO is that the people, they do trust our independence. They they trust us with their sensitive personal data, which they give us, and they also rely on us to produce the really good insight with the census results, and Cormac clearly highlighted it. So I think it's fair to say that the 5-yearly census has served us very well. But again, we heard about the changing landscape and the increased requirements at both the national and the international level. And also what was very evident during Cormac's presentation was that the real challenges in collecting data from households and persons. Response rates are going in one direction, both nationally and internationally. It's getting harder to get access to the doorstep. Where we do get access, there's a reluctance on people to participate. They've less time on their hands, and society is changing in that respect. There's also the logistical challenges of running a huge operation like a census. 262 interview boards, 5,500 enumerators for a 10-week period, and all the challenges that go with that recruitment process, Garda vetting, interviews, distribution of materials, training. It really is an enormous logistical operation. I suppose on a more positive note, we do have the really increased availability of very high quality data from administrative sources. And virtually all of these administrative data sources have PPSN, and increasingly so, there's an increased prevalence of error code. So really in the CSO, that has allowed us, and it's right across the CSO and way beyond census, it has allowed us to significantly improve the quality of our existing survey operations. It's allowed us to drop questions from survey and substitute it with administrative data. It allows us to quality checks with administrative data. We can produce new statistical outputs using administrative data on its own, blending administrative data with survey data. But I suppose from the census perspective, and Tim described the Irish population estimates from administrative data sources, it's a really positive development in terms of the population measurement. So I suppose internationally, there's a shift away from traditional census, at EU level particularly so, but on a global basis, there's discussions like this happening in many other countries as to what the future of census taking should look like. And you'll hear from Jen from the England and Wales experience shortly. Just to remind ourselves on how the traditional census is already evolving, Cormac described how Census 22 really used a lot of administrative and utility data to address non-response and coverage issues with the census. Also, we've used administrative data to take questions off the census questionnaire and allow for other questions and to reduce the respondent burden. After every census, we review everything, the questionnaire. In order to remain relevant, we've a full kind of public consultation on future questionnaires. That's ongoing now for the 27 questionnaire. And we will update the questionnaire to reflect kind of changes in society. We're also introducing the online response option in 27, which is a really positive development, and it will help kind of allow us address some of the non-response challenges in getting access to apartment blocks and that, where it will provide an alternative mode of response for the householders. Looking at the future of census taking and the public consultation, as I said, this is the first step in the public consultation process, and we will reflect on the kind of findings from today's seminar. The intention is to produce a paper during the second half of the year, and we'll look at a much broader, wider public consultation where we'll invite both online and paper submissions. And we certainly will take all views into consideration. And as I said earlier, we've no fixed view on the way forward. If we look at the kind of options for consideration, and it's kind of you have these options, but it's combinations of these options really. So, and we are talking about the post-2031 environment. So we have the traditional census, the administrative type census, the IPEDs, and then the Irish Community Survey, which Tim described. And all of these approaches have their strengths and challenges. So if we just maybe have a look at each of these in turn and their particular strengths and challenges. First, the traditional census, I suppose looking at its strengths, it's a long-standing source of official statistics. Cormac described in detail the very granular, attribute-rich data that we provide from the traditional census. And there is that rich historical and genealogical perspective. And the traditional census does allow us as well to enumerate hard-to-reach population subgroups. But I suppose looking now at some of the challenges, we've heard already that the 5-yearly census will not meet the demands both nationally and internationally for annual census-type information. Response rates are falling, and particularly so in the difficult-to-enumerate groups. It's also a very costly, large-scale logistical operation, and there is a response burden for households with the census. The Irish Community Survey now, that offers many of the strengths of the traditional census. So you do get the granular attribute-rich data. So the attribute data is the kind of characteristics on the persons and households. Now, you do get it at a particular level of geography, but not quite as detailed as the census, since it will be a sample survey. But there is scope in the community survey to kind of rotate characteristics. So you're getting, there is potential there for more frequent data on the attribute data, on attribute and characteristics and that. And like the census, it can allow enumeration of hard-to-reach population subgroups where you actually target promotion and that in order to try and boost response. The challenges, again, similar to the traditional census, response rates are falling, and Tim described a way to try and get a high level of response there in terms of making it mandatory. Logistically, it would be a large-scale operation with a big field involvement, and there is the element of response burden. If we look now at the Irish population estimates from administrative data sources, the real strength is it's very efficiently obtained data from existing data sources. It's frequent, it's timely, it's got very granular information that's improving over time, particularly as the air code coverage improves, and it will allow us to meet the national and EU demographic needs going forward. And there's almost universal coverage too with the administrative data, and there is no burden on households in terms that the data is already collected for administrative purposes. Moving on to the challenges. Well, I suppose one of the main challenges is it's not collected for statistical purposes, the data. So it's collected for administrative purposes. But we do have techniques in the CSO to derive the statistical data we need from that administrative data. Probably the biggest challenge is the limited attribute data that's available. Tim described on the IPEDs what is available, the age, sex, nationality, sector of employment, principal economic status, but there isn't data on religion, use of the Irish language, ethnicity isn't widespreadly collected on administrative sources, and it's difficult to identify various population subgroups. So that broadly kind of summarises the strengths and challenges with the three main approaches. So I'm just going to put the final slide up really, which is a slide Tim had up, and it does summarise the options. And as we said earlier, our sense is there will be a traditional census in 31, so this is looking out into the 2030s. And the four options are really the 5-yearly traditional census with IPEDS. Another option would be a 10-yearly census with IPEDS, a 10-yearly census with IPEDS and the Irish Community Survey, or Irish Community Survey along with the IPEDS. And I think what's really clear is that to meet the annual requirements going forward, IPEDS is certainly going to feature. It is the only way to provide that annual census type data. So we're really here to listen and to take your views into account. And maybe before I pass back to Etna, I might just like to thank the NSB, to thank Anne, Etna and Martina and the other NSB members for hosting the seminar. I'd like to thank the other speakers and also to thank the audience for coming along and participating today. We really do appreciate it in the CSO. So with that, I'll pass back to Etna.
Thanks, Richie. Well, we heard an awful lot of material there, and we have the 5 options, and I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of questions. So I'm going to see, are there any questions from the floor, and maybe some techie person can tell me if there's any questions on Slido. So are there any questions from the floor? John.
Thank you very much, John Fitzgerald, Trinity College and ESRI. IPEDS is really interesting, but one thing you didn't discuss was collecting additional information in administrative data, which would supplement what IPEDS. I'm particularly thinking about migration. You say you have nationality on administrative data. That's useless for migration. You have people coming from Northern Ireland who are Irish. You have Irish kids born abroad coming home. From a policy point of view, it is where people are born. If from administrative data they collected where people are born, and the other really important issue is whether people lived abroad. That's Irish returning immigrants. The ESRI shows that's really important in terms of productivity. So could you supplement what you need from that source? Because the community survey, the US community survey, the sample size means that for the first time in 170 years, you can't find out the characteristics of Irish people born in Ireland living in the United States. So the sample size in terms of migration is a major problem with a community survey. So could you do it through additional administrative data?
Well,
Okay.
I suppose one thing I would say is, in terms of evolving data sets, we're continually evaluating the data sets that would become available. So the idea is that while at the moment, say, we have a specific number of data sets that are used in IPEDS, we can continue to examine them over time. So the idea really is that as more data collection sources become available, but the key question really is with every new data set is the level of PPSN coverage in particular, because it's a pseudonymized data set. So say that if a data set, for example, is present, but it doesn't say have a very high level of PPSN coverage, or at least where, like I said, that there isn't non-missing at random elements of the PPSN, that's kind of the key precursor. So the idea is more administrative data sets becoming available is one thing, but the key driver really for IPEDS would be the level of PPSN coverage in the data sets, and it would also be as well over time the level of air codes as well. So they'd be the two drivers.
So is there any work being done on looking at, I know in the NSB we've been discussing, for example, the possibility of collecting hours of work data through revenue. But again, it's about how much more attribute data will people collect for administrative purposes. And I suppose that does depend on whether it makes administrative sense or not.
Yes. Now, the one thing to note, though, in answer to that question is there may be cases where we'll be able to identify through studying of administrative data sets more detailed information on topics such as migration, but there will always be an inherent and very important group of attribute data that it won't be possible to capture via administrative data. So that would be one of the prime drivers for an Irish community survey should it be chosen to be implemented. So the idea is that certainly the idea of what variables are to be obtained under IPEDS, there will be an element of examining as government data sets evolve and as government data collection evolves. And this will be an ever-evolving this will be an ever-evolving product. But at the same time, there will also be inherently certain variables that we won't be able to get via administrative data.
Okay, I have some of the Slido questions, so I might take the first Slido question and then over to Nat, and then the second Slido question, and then over to Jerry, okay?
Okay.
For the first question there, if you can see it, how would CSO propose to quality assure the IP's approach without a census benchmark?
That's a good question. Now, I suppose one thing which would be important in the beginning would be that, say, the IP's developmental process, we will be looking at a variety of different approaches. We're currently using a rules-based approach, but one of the things which we may well be looking at as part of a validation process would be looking at, say, stochastic or other approaches. Also, that if we have other data sets available, that, say, for example, if we have an Irish community survey, that could potentially form the basis of a validation as well of IPs as well. So the idea is that either be a combination of some kind of dual system estimation approach, but in the beginning, certainly with IPs, we would be benching it off. There will be a census benchmarks available for several years at least. There will also be the possibility as well of we will be examining the rules-based approach in comparison to other potential approaches to modelling populations, just a stochastic approach. So there will be quite a lot of quality assurance with IPs as it continues to evolve.
Okay, Nat O'Connor.
Hi, Nat O'Connor from Age Action and Chair of the Irish Social Policy Association. Just related, I suppose, to the quality assurance, if you're using administrative data from different public bodies, obviously they're gathering the data for their own purposes. What happens? You're at the mercy of them if they decide to ask for data differently or to stop gathering certain data, and that obviously can throw a spanner in the works in terms of your own modelling. So what role, if any, might there be given to the CSO, the NSB, or some other process to ensure that data is being gathered, say, in the same way across different public administrative bodies, or indeed adding questions that you might need to fill in some of the gaps?
Yes, in fact, that actually covers, there's two potential approaches there. One part would be obviously as part of the national data infrastructure and the ongoing work of the CSO and the National Statistics Board with government agencies in ensuring the continuous flow of the required administrative data sets. But an important element possibly of our, say, examining elements such as, say, modelling-based approaches in conjunction with the rules-based approach would be to exactly address those kind of scenarios.
Yeah, I think just to follow on from Tim's point, we've very good working relationships with the providers of the administrative data. We've regular liaison with them, and they certainly are aware of our uses of the data and also kind of particular kind of data needs. So there is that ongoing formal and informal relationship between the CSO and the data providers.
Right, David Rouse, I think, is just a comment there about bodies such as the owners' management companies may be useful for apartments.
Yeah, I can feel that. It is a good suggestion, and it is something that we've already done for Census 2022, particularly in the context of those difficult to access areas, apartment buildings and gated communities. Mixed success, but it is something we've undertaken. We've also undertaken contacts with local post offices, fire services in order to get access codes to these buildings. So we're very open to those kind of suggestions. As I said, it is something that we've done so far, but it still remains a difficulty. It isn't always successful. People don't always want to interact with the CSO with the best will in the world. But yeah, it has been tested and tried.
Jerry O'Hanlon.
Jerry O'Hanlon, former CSO. In fact, I was reflecting that during my career at the CSO, I may have been involved directly or indirectly with about 6 censuses, which is about a quarter of the censuses undertaken to date in the state. But in thinking about the issue, I think the key issue in going forward, in my view, is really what is it we're actually targeting to do? What's the output or the priority outputs we want to get out of it? But maybe we get caught there because there will be competing requirements. I'm trying to think about it recently in a different context, and that is that if you stand back from the traditional census, what in fact you do with the traditional census is create, for a point in time, in other words, Census Day, a statistical population register with a wide number of data of statistical interest for which you generate your analysis. really, okay, you're now turning and saying, of course, your new demands are being driven by Europe and so on. But I have an impression a lot of these demands are coming from countries which have active population registers. And by that I mean where you have personal identifiers and you have active arrangements, administrative arrangements in place to ensure that people register where they are residing at a particular point in time. We don't have that here, and I was struck, I think, by Tim's thing in saying that IPIDS, therefore, has a difficulty in actually getting to household level analysis. So I wonder whether the target we have going forward is perhaps kicking off from a traditional census and using the administrative data to actually try and produce an updated annual statistical register of the population, which will generate the wide range of data. I have one particular question in regard to that is, and a word now, a new word, pseudonymized, use of the PPSN and so on. Is there a restriction on the use of the PPSN directly in the census, the traditional census itself, for example? Because I think it would be absolutely essential if one was to try and target getting an up-to-date annual statistical population register, that you could use the PPSN or collect the PPSN level in the traditional census. On a different tack, just I'll finish on this, it's mentioning the community survey. What size of sample are you talking about? We have 2 million households in the country at the moment. We already have, I think, a very large labour force survey, formerly the Quarterly National Household Survey, at 30 or 40,000 annually, if my memory serves me correctly. I mean, but what are we talking about in terms of the ICS? And finally, my own option going forward would have been your third bullet point, maybe with some of the embellishments that we're talking about. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry, and appreciate the questions and the insights. I suppose one question first, in terms of the idea of using a census as a base, then rolling it forward as administrative data. The main complication then is, say, new national arrivals into the country. So what will happen in those cases is that there are people who will be detected, say, on, say, the IPIDS or the administrative data analysis, but the other auxiliary information that we would have, say, from the census variables, we wouldn't necessarily have for those people. But it is certainly a potential, as an example of a potential benchmarking-based approach. It's an example of something we're looking into in terms of the households. But the main complication would be the fact that you still would be dealing with a large number of, say, new arrivals in the country for which a lot of the census information wouldn't be available. So after a while, the item non-response would get more increased over time. I suppose then the question then on the ICS. Now, I suppose an example of a number that could be used as the idea of a survey. Now, again, this is literally just my own view, say, my own personal view would be, you'd be targeting around 75,000 households on an annual basis. Now, again, we're using approximately, say, similar numbers to, say, the American Community Survey. If we, say, extrapolated those onto an Irish context, that's the number of households we'd be looking at. The idea really then would be that you get certain level of attribute data at a national level, but then as you pool to, say, 3-year estimates, you would then be able to get, say, at the lower geographical areas, you'd have sufficient sample sizes. But we'd be looking at, say, around 75,000 households. This is just my own numbers here. But this would be based, of course, on the mandatory approach, and the mandatory approach would be the key precursor for that, I think.
Okay, anybody else want to pick up some of Jerry's points?
No, I think, Jerry, you're right in terms of the European situation. Like the European regulations are primarily, the majority of EU countries have those type of population registered, and the legislation is geared that way. But we do have to meet the requirements, and it is an output-based approach, so it's up to ourselves to choose the approach we use to meet the requirements. But from what we can see, certainly IPIDS provides the best way of meeting the challenge.
It does. Just one other thing to note as well is the point on usual residence. A lot of the register-based countries with the proposed EU requirements now, because of the fact that the register-based requirements are often different, say national registers are often slightly different they're more like de facto, say, than usually resident in themselves. Squaring those approaches to Eurostat, the Eurostat requirements can have complications as well.
Okay, there's a few questions on the Slido, and some of them have rotated, so I'll take them in the order they came in first, I think. Has it been considered before, or would it be for future census, to look at issues like racism or sexual violence?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I referenced in my presentation that we conduct a fairly wide-ranging public consultation process on the content of the census form, which is at a fairly advanced stage now for 2027. Basically, we open the floor, as it were, to the public interested stakeholders to submit their requirements in terms of new questions and revisions to questions for the next census. So just in the context of racism, I think it's probably worth noting that we have a number of variables on the census form in 2022 that might be relevant in that space. Ethnic group, country of citizenship, place of birth. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's very likely they're going to be on the 2027 census form and probably for 2031 as well. For 2031, that process will be looked at again in terms of new questions that might appear on the form that time round. You know, you can, as I mentioned, one of the real strengths of census data is cross-tabular data. So you can take any of those variables that I mentioned and look at, you know, the context in terms of both over time for previous censuses and how it looks in terms of things like, you know, level of education, economic status, whether people are employed, unemployed, the areas that they work in. So there's quite a lot that can be done already with existing census data. And just in terms of the sexual-based violence, so I guess in theory that's open to potential inclusion. I'm not sure if it's part of the current discussion for 2027, but it is worth mentioning that there is quite a lot of data output already by CSO. Richie might say more about it in terms of the sexual violence survey that was released last year. So CSO is quite active in that area as it is.
Yeah,
Richie, do you want to?
yeah. I think in terms of the topics like sexual-based violence, which is a hugely sensitive topic, and we undertook a survey on the prevalence of sexual violence over the last number of years, and the sensitivity and the challenges in collecting that data, it's not really something I foresee on the census form. The census is quite a blunt instrument where you're sending it to households in a self-completion environment, and if you could just think of a lot of the sexual-based violence actually take place within the household, you'd have to wonder how appropriate it would be to include it on a census form that's been filled out amongst householders. So,
Okay, I think this is probably a key question. There's 3 likes on it. How to manage public perception of CSO if frequency of surveys increases, for example, via the Irish Community Survey. Is there a risk of Big Brother perception pervading? Maybe that's for you, Richie.
I think it's there's additional response burden there. Certainly, it will be quite a large-scale survey, but I think we've a very good communications and promotions team who kind of, you may have heard a lot of radio ads around we launched a rolling household budget survey where we very good advertising explaining the public benefit of the surveys and the encouraging respondents to participate in the survey. So look, there's no doubt there will be an element of response burden, but I think there's ways we can manage it if it is the route we can go down. And I think people do like to see themselves in the data, so if we can make the results available at the small area, there's ways of getting respondents to participate in terms of seeing themselves in the data.
Has a cost comparison exercise been conducted for each of the options from 2031?
We're at the very early stages, and we purposely kind of excluded costs at this stage. We're looking at the overall kind of, we're just trying to get a sense from people what they see as the direction of travel. So we haven't done the cost comparison, but you would have to look at sample sizes for the community survey and the level of geographic detail required. So that's kind of will be a latter stage of the process.
Okay. Are there any questions from? I'll take one from the floor there.
Hi, Wayne Stanley from the Simon Communities of Ireland. My question was actually, my first question was similar to the first one, so I won't repeat it, but I do think all the speakers mentioned the affection And I would also hold that affection for the census and the data, and also to say what exceptional colleagues are in the CSO whenever we're looking for data, or it's a real public service in the true sense of the word. So I think it's really important that we hold on to that. And I would share the concern around not just fatigue, but also the sort of popular moves there are to undermine state collection of data, and holding on to the census form, I think, has a job in and of itself in doing that. I suppose the primary area of our concern is homelessness, and I'm conscious that in the first two examples, it was noted that both the census and the community forum reaching people who are experiencing homelessness or documenting homelessness is one of the difficulties in those kind of data, but it wasn't mentioned for the IPEDs, and I'm just wondering where could we make progress on those kind of difficult to reach populations, and which are the best options, or is it a combination of all of them?
Thank you. I suppose one point in relation to the IPEDs, I suppose, is that in effect, because you're considering people with their air codes and their interactions and addresses, homelessness could be an example of a variable where homeless people's interactions with state systems might be detected because, say, if they have PPSNs, but their actual air code information, it'd be an example, for example, like college students, one of the groups where getting the precise locations might be slightly more difficult. That's one thing to note then with the Irish Community Survey, was that if we considered, the idea really would be that, say, the kind of attribute information. Now, I'm just looking at the American example here. But one thing was with the American Community Survey was there was a very strong emphasis on communal establishments, and, for example, groups such as the homelessness, to kind of the collaboration with stakeholders in particular to ensure that there was suitable identification. So to ensure, in other words, that the actual attribute of homelessness could be determined would probably be in terms of the community survey, but stakeholder engagement would be very important there.
Okay, we've 3 minutes left, so there's a lot of questions coming in on the Slido. We'll take a couple of them and the rest will be left to the final session. So where does the Irish Health Survey and the National Household Survey fit into the long-term plans? Richie, maybe you take that.
Yeah, well, as it stands, the National Health Survey will proceed in its usual frequency. Sorry, the other survey, the National Household Survey. So yeah, I assume that's the household budget, the household budget or labour force survey. As it stands, they'll continue with their usual periodicity, so quarterly for the labour force survey, and the health survey with its frequency. But potentially, if the Irish Community Survey was to develop, there could be scope to include a kind of a modular-based approach to that survey, where you would collect data on health and possibly other topics, and it has been used in other countries. But again, it's something down the road that we could take into account, depending on the options, the pathway chosen.
Okay, the next one is about, would IPEDS data be collected for historic purposes or available in 100 years?
I suppose one thing to note is IPEDS is proposed as an annual population estimate. So in terms of say the kind of the census retention, normally is centered around the actual census data that's collected, whereas for IPEDS it's really would be considered as a replacement for the annual population estimate data which we produce already. So I mean, in my own view is I'd see it as a separate product as such, that because of the fact that in effect it's being used to produce a replicate of the existing official annual population estimates.
Okay, Aidan Punch, what assumptions are being made about the online option? And Aidan was Mr. Census for many years.
Well, I suppose looking at international colleagues, you know, a lot of the English-speaking countries have been doing online censuses for many years now, and the rates of online return regularly exceed 80%. I think in the case of Jen and the ONS and our colleagues in ESRI, Northern Ireland, they had 90% uptake rate online last time round. So I think the citizenry is getting more and more used to undertaking a lot of their state-related business online, such as completing your motor tax and so on. So for the time being, the working assumption is 80%, but it is something that we need to keep an eye on. Obviously, it'll impact the number of paper forms that we print, but we're certainly not going to be in a position where we underestimate the number of paper forms that needs to be printed. It might be something we need to look at as part of our processing contract for next time round if there's a print-on-demand feature. So that's the working assumption at the moment, but it probably is a little bit conservative, which is probably a good thing in the context of what happens internationally.
Now we've hit the magic coffee time, so I know there's people waiting to ask more questions and there's more there, but there will be opportunities later on, and some of you might like to also engage in informal chat with our colleagues over coffee. I'd like to thank very much our three speakers, Cormac, Tim and Richie. And so back in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Are we all ready? Microphones come on. Thank you everybody for being here today, and welcome back to the second session of our morning on the future of how censuses are conducted in Ireland. So after a very interesting and informative first session on the representatives from the CSO, talking about the experience here in Ireland, the second session is going to take a view from our nearest neighbours and take some lessons from how censuses are conducted elsewhere. So we're very, very delighted to be able to introduce Jennet Woolford from the UK's Office of National Statistics. And Jen is the Director of Population Statistics for England and Wales. So she's in charge of both the census there and also in charge of what we were discussing a bit this morning, the increased use of administrative data to fill in the gaps between census periods. And that's a particularly big factor in the UK, where the census are taken on a 10-year rather than a 5-year basis. So the ONS have been making a big shift away, I think, from the census as a kind of the baseline of population statistics to one that's centred much more around administrative data at its core. And Jen has been there for, I think, 25 years now, so she's been in charge of multiple censuses and a lot of changes in terms of the development and intensity of use of administrative data. So we're very happy to have her here to share that experience and discuss some of the pros and cons of the different discussion approaches and how they might help guide our discussions on where the Irish census will go over the next 10, 20 years. So I'll pass it over to Jen for her presentation for 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time for discussion at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to visit Dublin and a great pleasure to be here talking to you all today about the work that we are doing in England and Wales on the future of the census. And one of the things that struck me listening to the presentations earlier, as well as just what great presentations they were, so thank you very much, is just how much similarity there is, but also some really subtle differences between what we're doing in England and Wales and what's happening internationally and globally and what's happening here in Ireland. So we have the same pressures for more frequent data, more granular data. We have the same issues with falling response rates to our surveys, with biases in those response rates as well. So there are some hard-to-reach communities. It's much harder to get responses from, both in our surveys and in census, and actually engaging with administrative data as well. We also don't have a population register in England and Wales, and we're in a slightly more difficult position in that we don't even have a unique number for people. So our different administrative systems have different numbers, national insurance numbers, national health numbers. So that gives us an extra challenge of linkage. So we're also doing lots of work thinking about what can we do with administrative data to answer those user needs. A few subtle differences in England and Wales is that as we've already said, the census in England and Wales is every 10 years, so we have a much greater gap between the two censuses. But also, we have a de jure census, so a census that records people where they usually live rather than where they are on census night. So we've had a few learnings around that. So as I say, we've been tackling the same issues. We, at the end of last year, ran a very similar consultation to this one, setting out what we can do with administrative data and asking our users their views on our plans and how far our plans went to reach their needs. So what I'm going to do is just talk through a little bit about what happened in 2021 in our most recent census, and also then some of the plans and the evidence that we produced to inform that consultation, and then a little bit about the consultation findings and where we go next. Another important point of context from the perspective of this presentation is that ONS is responsible for the census and for population estimates in England and Wales. So the responsibility for the census in Scotland and population estimates in Scotland sits with Scotland, and similarly Northern Ireland. I can see my colleagues from Northern Ireland there who will be very keen to say that the decision on the future of the census rests with them, not with ONS. So where I'm talking today, just take it that I'm talking about England and Wales. We have a slight complication, as always, in that migration is not a devolved matter. So where I talk about international migration, that's in and out of the UK. But for most of what I'm talking about, I'll be talking about England and Wales. So our most recent census was in 2021. We had already made the decision to move to an online first census data collection, which meant that in the run-up to the census, we were doing a lot of the work that was talked about earlier, thinking about how we engage with community groups in ways that would facilitate and enable online data collection as opposed to enumerators turning up at the front door, and putting lots of effort as well into other ways of reaching. If you don't have that enumerator turning up and being the face of the census, how do you get people to engage with the census? So we've been doing lots of thinking about that and around the online help. So what that meant was when COVID hit in 2020, we had, same as every other census taking organisation who was planning to run a census around that time, we had to decide whether we went ahead with the census in 2021 or whether we postponed it to 2022. And our colleagues in Scotland decided to postpone, but we in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland went ahead with the census in March 2021. Because we'd already done that work about moving to an online first census, we already had a lot of the infrastructure in place and a lot of thinking in place, which is one of the reasons why we felt it was possible for us to go ahead at that point in time. And you can see here, if you can read it, quite small numbers, that our engagement, our media engagement was really, really successful. So around the time of the census, we trended at 7th place on Twitter. We had over 2,000 pieces of media coverage. We engaged with over 10,000 stakeholders. And somehow, given that the population of England and Wales is just under 60 million, we engaged with 104 million social media users. So not quite sure how we managed that, but it's quite impressive. And also, really, really impressively, we got a 97% response rate. Now, we probably benefited from the fact that everyone was locked up and couldn't go ahead. And I think Herod might have tried something similar, but we'll maybe not go back there. Also, of course, everyone was making sure they were really well plugged into the internet. That was the only way of engaging with people and talking to people. So everyone was at home with a device that was well connected and very little else to do. So we think that probably contributed to that response rate that we got. And the fact that our online response rate was nearly 90% of households, just under 90% of households. And something that I found quite staggering is that over half of those were completed on mobile phones. Now, I don't know, I hate trying to fill in any kind of a form on a mobile phone, but obviously I'm in that older age group now, and my kids would probably have done it on their phones. So a really successful census. We had loads of data. The next question for us is, how do we know that it's any good? How do we make sure that we understand the quality of the data that we've collected? So as I say, we already had some top quality field work, collected excellent information around addresses, households and addresses that didn't respond, for example, that we could use. And then we had a range of different ways of understanding the coverage. So since 2001, in the UK, actually, we've run what we call a census coverage survey. This is an independent follow-up of just over 1% of the population, different independent kind of count that we can use then to link to our census results, that kind of capture-recapture, dual system estimation technique that was mentioned earlier, looking at who's in both lists, who's in one, who's in another, and using that to estimate coverage. I actually came over to Ireland and observed some of the field work in your 22 census, and I asked Mr. Census Aidan Punch about what were you doing here about a coverage survey, and he told me he'd rather spend his money and his effort getting it right in the first place. So it's a slightly different approach that we're taking. But as I say, that's quite a standard approach for us now. We ran it for the third time. That gave us confidence that we understood the coverage of our census data. And two things that were quite new for us. We've always kind of compared against other data that we've got, but in 2021, 2022, we have much more data available to us than we'd had in the past. So we had the Digital Economy Act back in about 2017, which gave some legal gateways for us to share more data, which has allowed us to bring much more data into ONS. So we have more alternative data sources we could compare against. And then another thing which I have to admit I thought was crazy was we wrote to every local authority in England and Wales in advance of the census and said, would you like to be part of our QA process? Would you like us to send you the first cut of your census results for you to have a look at, for you to tell us what you think, and for us to then consider that information as part of our quality assurance? Almost every local authority said yes, by which point I thought we were definitely crazy, and almost every one of those wrote back to us, some of them with huge portfolios of evidence, which we had to turn around really quickly. So we worked through all of that information, made some changes. We didn't implement everything that everyone wanted, otherwise we'd have ended up with a massive population. But we kind of took on board all of the learning that we got from that engagement with local authorities, and I'll come back to some of that engagement later. So we've got great data, we understand the quality of the data, but those data have no value until they're being used, until people are making the decision on the basis of them. So there are two aspects to that I wanted to bring out. The first is the importance of having the data and having the willingness to respond really quickly to urgent needs. So I'll focus more on the right-hand side here. Not long after the census, the conflict in Ukraine started, and the government at pace had to spin up their humanitarian response. How were we going to support people and refugees coming from Ukraine? And one of the questions they had was, where's the Ukrainian diaspora around England and Wales? So if you're going to think about where we place refugees, it would be nice to place them in communities where there's already Ukrainian-born population. So how could they work out quickly where that population was? So we turned this around in a matter of hours for that policy work, before we'd even published any census data. But we've managed to get it into a state where we could put our resources to it and answer these questions really quickly. And that's something we've been really trying to build on, is that responsiveness. And that we wouldn't have been able to do that without census data. Those were the only data we had that would have allowed us to do that work. But then beyond that responsiveness, we put a lot of work into thinking about how could we put data and insight into the hands of our users to really deliver the maximum benefits that we can from the census. So we did planning using a range of user personas that we set out here, that goes straight from the technical user who just wants the data. They don't want us messing around with it. They don't want us trying to interpret for them. They want their hands on the data and to do their own work. Right through to the passive citizen who isn't going to go looking for any information and will kind of absorb what he sees through the media and through social media and through conversations down the pub. So we then started thinking about what kind of a range of products will satisfy those different user needs, which went from a give me the data, let me explore the data myself, to a kind of help me understand the data that are there. And then working through those different personas, we developed a range of different products, ranging from data through commentary around the data, through exploratory products, and through explanatory products as well. And a whole list, many of these are kind of similar to the products that we saw earlier, but a whole list of kind of different ways of accessing and interrogating the data. And these are all live links, so if you want to see more about these, go and have a look at the slides later. But just to provide a bit of information about some of those. Census maps. So here you can go in, you can choose an area, you can choose a level of geography, you can choose the topics that you're interested in, and you can get a very detailed map of local geographies and of the characteristic of interest. So what we've got here is a map of London, the middle layer super areas in London, telling you the proportion of the population in each of those middle layer super areas who are Asian British or Asian Welsh. So you can see there where the areas are darker, that's where you've got higher percentages of the Asian population. Where they're lighter, that's where you have lower percentages. And then if you clicked on Becton there, that gives you the precise figure for Becton. which is just under 70% Asian population in that area. And those maps, you can zoom in, you can zoom out from them. If you click on the URL and copy it and send it to somebody, they will get the map you're looking at. They don't get a link to census maps, they get that map. Another project we're really proud of is build a custom area profile. So you can look at a geography, you can decide what geography you'd like to compare it to, you can decide what census variables you're interested in, and that will give you a report. So for example here, this is an area in Linehan in Hampshire in the local authority of Gosport. This is an area which is a kind of retirement area. It's on the coast. It's sort of an older population in this area. If you choose to look at the age of the population and levels of disability, for example, what you'll get is a report that says, here for the bars you can see are the area of interest, and then the lines are the comparator area, which you could choose England, you could choose Liverpool, or you can choose here the local authority. So what this will tell you really quickly is you can see that this is a retirement area. There are far fewer young people in this area than Gosport as a whole, but more older people. And perhaps then, unsurprisingly, there are much higher levels of disability in the area at Linehan here than there is in Gosport as a whole. The final product that I wanted to talk about quickly is something we're really proud of, a product that we developed in partnership with Sensible Code, who are represented here today, which is our Create a Custom data set. So we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of protecting data, keeping data we collect secure. But the other aspect of that is confidentiality and making sure that once you give people the maximum access to the data that you can, you protect individuals and individuals' information. And it's a really tricky balance because that's a kind of spectrum. If you want to keep it totally safe, you don't provide any information at all. And if what you want to do is provide as much information as you can, then you put all the data out there and you have to make a decision where you want your confidentiality rules to be set to hit that balance. And what we would do, so we have kind of disclosure control rules. You can obfuscate the data, shift things around, do a bit of record swapping. You can have thresholds below which you won't publish data. In the past, we'd published lots of standard tables, but if somebody had a bespoke need for a table, they would have to email our customer services. When they got to look at that email and in all the emails that they got, they would print out the table, they would do some automated disclosure checks, they'd do some kind of in-person, whatever the right word is, disclosure checks, possibly find out that the table wasn't a particularly good design right back to the users, so you might want to think about collapsing some of the variables or whatever here, and that could be quite a long drawn-out process. But what this tool does is it does all of that disclosure checking on the fly really, really quickly. So you can go in, specify the table that you want, it will come back almost instantly and say, okay, that's a table with 500,000 cells and half of those are suppressed. Do you want this table or do you want to think about specifying it slightly differently, asking for fewer ethnic group categories, for example? And that will be an individual choice, because if you're interested in where the Ukrainian population lives, you're not looking at the small numbers, you're looking at the big numbers, so you're quite happy with that table. If you're interested in smaller population groups, you might think, okay, I want to change the design of the table a bit, and you'll get information about how many cells, how much is suppressed, straight back, so you can then design your own table, get it instantly. So a really huge step forward for the user experience. And also something that we should be able to build on. All of these different output tools are things that are legacy for the future as well. So we've had a really successful census, lots and lots of innovation, lots of things we're really proud of. But there are problems, particularly if you think about not just the census, but the whole population statistics system, which is it's a conversation we're having earlier as well. So the census is this amazing thing that happens in England and Wales. It happens again 10 years later. In between those times, you have to produce population estimates and statistics about the characteristics and attributes of the population, and that's hard. So we use a similar method where you do cohort components, you take your population, you add on births, you take off deaths, and you make an adjustment for migration, whether that's international migration, people coming in and out of the country, or internal migration, people moving around within the country. Both of those things we find hard. Internal migration getting harder because a lot of that is based on health records and whether people register with a new GP when they move addresses, which is happening less and less. My daughter is at university in Sheffield, which is about 300 miles away from where we live, but she stayed registered with her GP in Titchfield because she does everything via an app. And she can get her prescriptions delivered to the chemist in Sheffield still. There's no need for her to move her GP. So if people are not moving their GPs, we have real problems then with understanding internal population flows. So what we have is we tend to get a drift, and because each year when it's difficult, you get cumulative errors creeping into the data. So over a 10-year period at the national level, we can get quite a bit of drift. At the local level, that can be even more pronounced. And then you get your census and it benchmarks it and everything goes back to being lovely again for a few years. The other thing is those characteristics of the population. So I talked about the need of having those really small area. We tend to get those from surveys, and the surveys, they will not get you down to the kind of geographies that you get from a census. So many of them just regional level statistics. And all of this, COVID kind of hit us at kind of the worst possible point it could have done. We run up to a census, so obviously that was a challenge, but also the point in the cycle where our data is at its lowest quality. And it really flushed out, in particular, those two challenges with the data. So if you think about population estimates, the government were rapidly rolling out a COVID vaccine, needed to really understand who was taking the vaccine and who wasn't taking the vaccine, what vaccination rates there were. So for all of that, they needed to understand more about the population. They needed a denominator. That was a huge challenge for us because that denominator was a population estimate by age and sex down to small geographies at the weakest point of our system for that. So we had some real problems with vaccine denominators, lots of strange numbers coming out, 150% of the population being vaccinated, those sorts of things. So very publicly challenges as well. The other thing was that characteristics information. So during COVID, we had very localised outbreaks. There were some in Leicester, for example, which I think may have been driven by people working in meat packing plants. But there were lots of other things, multi-generational households, religious observation, all kinds of things that could have been driving those localised outbreaks. And we needed to have that small area information to understand why an outbreak was happening there, but it wasn't happening there. And local authority level stats just wasn't cooking it there. And we couldn't find the data, spent a lot of time looking at what we could get from different sources. So that kind of illustrates two big problems we have with the system. If it happened in 2022, 2023, we'd have been laughing, but it didn't. It happened, a lot of this was happening in 2020, 2021 when we didn't have the data available to us. So what that means is that we have a vision for our future population and migration statistics system in England and Wales that will be able to provide those more frequent, timely, inclusive statistics about the population through putting admin data at the core of our population and migration statistics system. That will give us a stats system that shapes our understanding of society and individuals, but importantly, it has to be sustainable and future-proof. It has to be able to flex and answer the questions of the day. And we want to build on that broad range of flexible outputs and products that I talked about earlier. Can we sit those above kind of linked administrative data sets to put the power of the data again back into the hands of the user? This slide is one, although it repeats some of the stuff I've already said, this is one that I do use quite regularly internally as well, because it's very easy to start thinking about individuals, just having a list of people, having their characteristics, and Bob's your uncle. The census is about much more than that. These are kind of statistical attributes of the census. There are others, non-statistical as well. You know, what does it mean to have a debate about society and how we want to describe ourselves as a society, what things are important to us. But in terms of the statistical angles, it is the population and population movement down to small areas, and it is the characteristics of the population. It's also housing, accommodation, living arrangements, how people live together, who are our families, what are the household units that we live in. And then the other thing that we're putting increasing emphasis on in our work is looking at outcomes. So looking at longitudinal data. So we have in the UK, all the countries have a longitudinal study that takes linked census data over decades. So in England and Wales, started in 1971. We've linked a sample of that census data 1971 through to 2021 now. It's up to date. And then we link various health data to those records in between as well, cancer registration, which provides this amazing analytical resource so people can look at people's outcomes. Someone who's diagnosed with cancer at a certain point in time, you've got their attributes, you'll have the stage at which the cancer was diagnosed, and you can look at treatments and outcomes there. So we want to build much more of those kind of longitudinal data assets as well. We built one during COVID under the special COVID regulations so that we could look at the impact of a COVID infection, for example, or we could look at the impact that vaccines have, how effective are vaccines. So we know the value that we can get from these linked data assets. We're building one for refugees to look at how well refugees are integrated in society. We're building one for veterans, so we can look at how well, as a country, we're doing against the Veterans Covenant. So lots of things that, lots of interest now in looking not just at kind of cuts in time data, but that longitudinal data as well. So I'm going to take some water, give you all a break from my voice for 2 seconds. So how are we doing this? So we're starting from a number of different administrative data sets, many of the similar data sets, health, employment, school records, tax and benefits data. And we link those data sets together. We have the additional challenge, remember, that not all of that we don't have a single identifier on those data sets, so we have to do that. Linkage is quite a challenge for us, but we also use that to kind of deduplicate some of the data as well, where people are in some data sets more than once. So that gets us to what we call our demographic index, which is an enormous long list of people. It may be the 100 million people who interacted with social media and don't live in the country, don't know, but that's much greater than our population itself. So we also use signs of life, looking at how recently and how frequently people are engaging with the administrative processes that give rise to that administrative data, and deciding whether that's a sufficient sign of life for us to move them from that demographic index into our statistical population data set. Now, those rules aren't hard and fast. There are decisions to make there. And the decisions you make will decide how much kind of over-coverage and under-coverage there is in that statistical population data set. So if I've interacted with the health service in the last 3 years, is that sufficient evidence? Or do you want me to have interacted in the last 6 months? And so you can flex those rules, and we've done a lot of work around what do those rules look like. So we've got ourselves to a statistical population data set. Looks quite similar in terms of the size to the census. It's got some really key attributes about age, sex and location, and that goes down to address for us. Back to that question about is it any good? So what do we do and how do we understand the coverage of that list? And there are a number of things that we can do there. So we could look at having a coverage survey, similar as we do to the census, and we've done some work looking at the census coverage survey and how that links against the SPD. We could try and find an independent data source. I think here in Ireland you're looking at driving licence registrations. Is that sufficiently independent that you can use that, compare it to your other admin data sources to understand coverage? One of the other things we're doing is building on that engagement with local authorities. So one of the local authorities we are engaging with a lot is Manchester. Manchester has a very interesting and vibrant population with lots of change. They took us in a taxi around some of the more challenging areas of Manchester, one of which was Moss Side, where there are lots of houses of multiple occupation. How do we understand that? Another was an area that tends to be an area where refugees and immigrants settle when they first arrive, just for a very short period of time, and then they move out to the areas where they're going to be settled for longer periods of time, so rapid change there. And then the third was an area that had been quite wasteland and was now really high-end apartment blocks, so had a rapid influx of Man City players into these blocks of flats. And then what we can do is look at their local information and how quickly they can see people taking up these flats, and what that means for our data sources, whether our health data are picking them up at the same time or whether there are more challenges we need to do. So we're not just looking at kind of high-level, national-level comparisons. We're getting down on the ground with the local authorities, understanding their local data, using their local insight to understand, to learn lessons that we can then apply more generally. We've then got a population model, which takes this coverage-adjusted stock of the population and then takes all of those flow data that we were talking about earlier as well. So births, deaths, our estimates of international and internal migration also go into the model. And then we think about other data sources that may also help us with our population estimates. So, for example, fertility rates, mortality rates, sex ratios. These are the sorts of things that will tell us a little bit more about the credibility of the estimates that we're getting. So all of those things go into our population model, and at the other end comes our admin-based population estimates. We similarly have millions of acronyms. The ones that are admin-based, our estimates always start with an AB for admin-based. They're admin-based population estimates. Characteristics of the population, we have been calculating by linking administrative data to that statistical population data set. We can weight that statistical population data set now to be consistent with our admin-based population estimates. And through linking those different data sources together, that allows us to get estimates of characteristics of the population, to be able to do cross-tabulations of different characteristics, and to get those down to small areas. And again, this is somewhere where our local engagement is having a really key place. Our local engagement with community groups, for example, and an example of that is our engagement with the Sikh community in England and Wales, who have obviously a real interest in understanding the size and the shape of the Sikh community. And working with a local authority there who has quite a large Sikh population to understand the data that they hold on their local data systems about Sikh ethnicity, and then can we bring locally held data into that system to help us to improve those estimates. So lots of engagement happening in that process. We ran our consultation, and similar consultation to this, in the summer of last year. And as part of that consultation, we had a package of evidence setting out the research that we've done to date and looking at the quality of that research. So I'm just going to quickly run through that now. What you've got on the left-hand side there is our admin-based population estimates and our mid-year estimates at local authority level, looking at how they compare to each other. And in general, our admin-based population estimates are a little bit higher, but looking pretty similar, almost everybody within 1%. If you compare those two data sources together, there are some outliers, so we can do a bit more work looking at, can we understand what's happening with those outliers. Usually the one at the far end is the Isles of Scilly, because the population is so small, it only takes being 2 people out for it to be quite a large percentage. But still, it's important that we get them right. And then on the right-hand side here is a population pyramid, so looking at those comparisons by age and sex. This is for Coventry, which is a city with 2 large universities in it. And the bars are our admin-based population estimates, and the line there is our mid-year estimates, the rolled forward ones. So you can see very similar by age and sex as well, but the areas of the biggest difference are around that kind of university student, higher education student age group. So obviously that's an area then we can look at in more detail and see what information can we get from on university students that may help us to understand that. And one of the challenges that we had with a usually resident enumeration was students. So conducting a census during COVID had the challenge of there were very few international students in the country, so they were not enumerated at all. And that may be why we're seeing some of the difference here, is because we've seen a huge return of international students, and Warwick University, which is in Coventry, has in particular a huge number of overseas students. And then the other challenge we had was we tend to enumerate students at their term time address because that's where they tend to spend most of their time. But we think during COVID, there were far fewer students at their term time address than there would normally be. And so you were seeing fewer people in those kind of student age groups in an area, a university area, and more in the kind of non-university areas where their parents might well be living. And we think not just students, actually, that people who were career young, maybe in that category as well, if they were living in a bedsit and then lockdown happened, if they're kind of living in Westminster or whatever, they may well have decided that they weren't going to pay council tax there and they were going to go back to their parents' houses for the duration. So, partly because of that, one of the other things we looked at was what are we seeing with change over time? What can we see is happening in the population movement between 21 and 22? Are we seeing the kind of movement that we expected in our admin-based population estimates? And largely we were. What we saw were the areas with the largest population growth are those kind of inner city metropolitan areas, and the areas with the largest population decrease were those rural areas where you might be expecting to see young people move back into urban areas. So that's our population estimates. We also did a lot of work on population characteristics. So here, the first chart there on the left is our admin-based occupied addresses. So we can get to occupied addresses. That's different from households. It's different from families. For the vast majority of cases, and you can see here the top is our admin-based ones, the bottom is what we saw in the census, vast majority, they're very similar. So overall, that's looking pretty good. As always, the problem is that that's not evenly distributed across the country. And some of the areas, Moss Side, for example, I mentioned earlier, with lots of households and multiple occupation, you won't be picking that up necessarily from these data. So there's still a challenge there. How do you get from occupied addresses to households? One of the other things, I'm sorry, I could talk about this for ages. I will shut up at some point, I promise. One of the other things that we've been doing is because we do a usually resident census, tells you where people live, but people move around a lot as well. So if you're responsible for delivering services in the City of London, you've got a very small resident population, but you've got a lot of people there during the day who need services delivered to them. If you are Cornwall, you may not have. You'll have a lot more people there in the summer who are using your bins and setting houses on fire than you have kind of at other times of the year. So unintentionally setting houses on fire. So we're looking at can we provide some kind of innovative ways of giving that information about how population changes by the time of the year, by the time of day, by day of week. And one of the pieces of work we've been doing there is looking at, for example, at mobile phone usage. And can you see some of those population flows coming through by how and where people are using their mobile phones? Coming up with a product, Pop 24/7, which kind of shows what the population looks like at an average time of day on each day of the week. Other things that we've done, ethnic group. For broad ethnic group classifications, we've produced admin-based estimates that stack up well against the census estimates. So you can see those on the left. What the census will allow you to do is to get down into much more granularity, and that's still something we need to look at. But at the top level, looking pretty good there. We can also do multivariate statistics, those cross-tabulations. So the thing in the middle is looking at accommodation type by ethnic group. It's too small for me to read, but the Asian population tended to live much more in tenant buildings in Newham, whereas the black population tended to be more in a purpose-built block of flats. So we can kind of start to look at that cross-tabular information. And then the other thing that we can do, so there are some things that we know there's a really strong user need for, that but isn't suitable for collection in an online, like a personally completed questionnaire for a number of reasons. So income is one that we know there's a lot of interest in, but it's a complex subject. It needs to be, and we're worried about response rates. So the response rates there, we've never asked it on a census, but we have now produced some admin-based information on it. And I'm getting waved at, I shall speed up. So some very final bits. We've also looked at admin data on veterans, lots of interest in the veterans community. We've looked at disability and compared disability from admin records to the census, found very strong correlations there. We've looked at travel to work as well, because with the census being conducted in a lockdown, that was a question that was a real challenge on the census. We've also done some work to improve our migration statistics and understand flows of individuals by linking data longitudinally there. And that this is some example of what we've looked at with students and movements of international students, because the pandemic has really hit the inflows and outflows of students. So could we understand a little bit more about how long university students were staying in the country? So we ran a public consultation in the summer, saying how well does this meet your needs, and if it doesn't meet your needs, where are the gaps? We had, and here's a challenge for you, we had an amazing response. We had 706 responses from a range of different organisations, 340 organisations, 366 individuals, many of whom are genealogists. It was quite a diverse range of responses that we got, and some of them were very detailed. So it gave us lots of information about user needs. Overall, our users said either our proposals meet all of their needs or meet the vast majority of their needs, but there were concerns about the reliability of the supply of data that we get through, about some of the detail and the granularity, and I saw one of the questions earlier as well about the benchmark. How do we know if we're drifting here or not? So we are in the process now of going through all of those consultation responses, of drafting a National Statistician's recommendation for where do we go from here, taking that through our board, and that recommendation should be published end of March, early April. And then we are using all of that information we got to shape our future research plans, so we can focus on the priority areas for our users. And moving into, at the moment, all the results that I've shown you there are kind of research results. We now need to start to operationalise that and build it into a robust system that will allow us to produce population estimates on a really regular basis. And that's me. Very happy to take any questions.
Super, thank you so much, Jen. That was really fascinating. So we have time now for a couple of questions directly to Jen, and then this session will be followed by a broader panel session, which Jen will also be sitting on. So if we don't get through all of the questions on the England and Wales survey just in the next few minutes, you'll have another chance just after that. Okay, can we get a microphone maybe over to Helen here? There are mics. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Helen Russell, ESRI. You mentioned, it's a question about the social characteristics, and you said that the admin data is your benchmark there, that's what you use to weight the other data on that, and you mentioned some very interesting innovations about, trying to bring in the local data there, but that, it sounds pretty labour intensive. And I was wondering, is there any obligations on key government agencies or departments to collect particular pieces of information? So things like, place of birth or ethnicity or whatever. So is there any obligation? Have you any teeth in terms of obliging agencies to collect some key information? Thanks.
So we can't oblige anyone to collect information. It's very much a product of their of the service that they deliver and what they need in order to deliver that service. What we have got under the Digital Economy Act is a route to ensure that, to require people to share data with us. We don't tend to use the require route. We tend to try and use the share route instead. And under that as well, there is a requirement for anyone changing an administrative system to consult with the National Statistician. Again, there's probably a limit to how much influence we've got there, but they should be consulting with us, which should at least stop unexpected changes happening. The part of what we're thinking about is whether we can work with some agencies and ask them to collect additional information. So we already do that with birth registrations, for example. The registrar will collect some additional information about the parents for statistical purposes, but it's a long way to go. It's quite expensive for someone to change their administrative system to collect an extra bit of information, and then there are some real kind of quality issues. You're talking about the person on the front line often collecting information, and if you're stood over someone who's in a coma in a hospital bed, you're not going to ask them what their occupation is, sort of thing. So there is a little bit about how feasible and reasonable it is to ask.
Thanks, Jen. And the first question up there on the slide was kind of a little bit similar, which is related to comparing the census and admin data. So the questioner there says that's very insightful, but do you map the census data in full to alternative administration sources? And I guess this is the big challenge for the CSO in moving towards alternative sources. What are the major gaps, or are there any particular tricky areas that you faced?
So we've linked the census data at an individual record level to the admin data we've got as well, so we can use that to understand coverage and quality. And we have done lots of work. I've just given a kind of a feel for some of the stuff there where we've compared the two directly in terms of our maps and cross tabulations. There are, as always, lots of challenges. There are challenges. So, for example, we ask Welsh language proficiency in Wales. There are real government targets, Welsh government targets around increasing the level of Welsh language fluency in Wales. We get very different answers from our labour force survey and population surveys than we do from Census even. That's where all the collection is within our gift. With admin data sources, that just adds another kind of level of complexity. So we have got a specific programme of work thinking about how do we get a better understanding of levels of Welsh proficiency in Wales, with the possibility of doing it across England and Wales if we're using data sources that cover everyone. So there are lots of challenges as well, yeah.
Okay. And then we have two questions have come up about how online and remote censuses and administrative data manage to cover more marginalised groups. So maybe some of these questions might come up again for the broader panel, but just specifically, how do you reach kind of very small groups? So the examples here are Roma Irish travellers who might not be online or in regular contact with a lot of sort of administrative services.
Yeah, so during the census itself, they were some really key groups for us in terms of the community outreach, finding people who were kind of gateways into those communities, so community leaders who could help us to get those responses and could help promote the benefits of the census to their communities. We did things like go and collect data in kind of in mosques and things where we could kind of help people but also encourage response. In terms of administrative data, in some ways it's more inclusive because our social surveys are household based and so we don't get information from people who live in kind of managed accommodation. Admin data should get us more information about people living in managed accommodation. But for groups that don't have a fixed address, so rough sleepers, the travelling community, much more difficult, and there we'll need to think about how we engage with local authorities and look at locally held data sources. Generally, our local authorities know more about people who are sleeping rough on the streets than we would do centrally.
Okay, feel free to put up, does anybody else from the floor want a question before I take the last one or two from Slido? So the question on, with an online census, and again, sort of an area where the CSO would be very interested in. How do you engage with non-internet users? And is there a possible loss of privacy or independence if somebody is completing a form for somebody else?
So what we did in 2021 is we identified areas where we thought there would be less connectivity, so populations and areas for that, and we sent out paper questionnaires to those people. So they had the option of, they would have a code, so everyone had a code that they would use. We sent a postcode out to everybody with a unique code on it for an online response, but also we sent a questionnaire to people who we thought might have more difficulty completing online. The majority of those people actually did complete online in the end. So we had a much higher response rate online than we expected, but also there are opportunities for people to phone up and complete the census questionnaire on over the phone, for example.
Okay, I'll just take one last one from here because I know that there's a wider panel, and some of these questions probably overlap with things people might want to ask our wider range of panelists. But we have a well done smiley face from somebody, which I think excellent job by the ONS. But a broader question on how did the ONS develop this system that allows for you to zoom down to the county, city, detailed geography level?
So that's because we have a kind of we have an infrastructure that has a list of individuals and a list of addresses. So we have unique property addresses as well, and then we also have a list of businesses. And by having the link through from the individuals through to their unique property reference number, that allows us to say these people are in this precise location, and then we can build up the geographies from that. Again, you know, lots of challenges. It's not perfect. It doesn't have everyone. It doesn't get everyone's location absolutely right. But it's much better than what we have without admin data between the census periods.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious that I haven't gone through all of the Slido questions, but we do have a broader panel discussion that Jen will be staying on for. So let me wrap up this session, pass on to the broader panel, and say thank you very much once again to Jen for joining us here today.
Hello. Hello again, everybody. We're at our last session of the seminar, and we have a hard stop at 1:30, so we promised to have you out by then. We asked 3 people with different perspectives to respond to the CSO presentations, and they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll follow that with questions and answers specifically to themselves, and then by an open forum where we'll pick up any other questions and questions we may have not had the opportunity to deal with on Slido. As I say, the 3 speakers are expert in their own fields. They're heavy users of the census, and they each, as you will hear, have a passion for what they do. I'll introduce the 3 as a run, and they will speak one after the other, and then we'll take the questions. Our first speaker is Helen Russell. Helen's a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute. She's head of the Social Research Division there and coordinator for research on quality of life. Her research covers a range of interconnecting issues relating to employment, equality, and social inclusion. Recent equality research looked at the impact of the recession on employment and unemployment across a range of grounds covered by equality legislation, including gender, age, disability, and nationality. Our second speaker is Martin Quigley. Martin is the Director of Data and Analytics with Pobal. Pobal, as most people know, is a programme management and grant-making agency that works on behalf of government to promote social inclusion. Since joining Pobal, Martin has led the development of its data science and analytic functions and championed the use of the administrative data sets for programme and policy improvement. Martin oversees the commissioning of the Pobal HP Deprivation Index and supports state agencies in using this tool, and he'll tell us more about that. Martin is a member of the Board of Management of Oberstown Children Detention Campus, just to give you a little bit of other information. Our third speaker is Catriona Crowe. Catriona is an archivist and well-known broadcaster. She is former head of special projects at the National Archives of Ireland. She was manager of the Census Online project, which placed the Irish 1901 and 1911 censuses online, free to access. She presented, among many things, the RTE documentaries Ireland Before the Rising and Life After the Rising. She is chairperson of the SAIL project, which is an advocacy, education and rehab centre for women with addiction issues in Dublin's North Inner City. And she is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. I really look forward to each of their presentations, and we're absolutely delighted that you join us today. So, Helen, please.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much for the opportunity to come along and talk to you today. So I'm going to just share some thoughts about how we use the census at the ESRI to provide evidence for policy making, and how that might be supported in the future with some of the proposals. I'm just wondering, looking at Jen's presentation, do I fit into that, which of those groups? So I must be one of the a person who lives and breathes data and statistics. So maybe I'll have to own that identity. Okay, so I think there are three main areas where we use the census to provide evidence for policy. The first one is as a source of equality data, and that is to do micro-level analysis of economic and social outcomes. The second is around demographic projections, and that's sort of the more macro level analysis. And then the third level is sort of the meso level, as we'd call it. So that's looking at community level explanations of outcomes. And I'm going to leave that level to Martin, because Pobal is doing a lot of research there around looking at community level use of the data. So I'll just take through whether the alternative options provide the evidence we need, and what issues we need to look at for the future. So first of all, as a source of equality data, the census has been really important. I've just put up a selection of some of the studies that we've done in recent years using the census data. So looking at a couple of them there are on migrant integration, one around the labour market, and one about households and family. We've also used the census for research on people with disabilities and the traveller community. So I think this illustrates one of the key strengths, and why we use the data here is because it contains information on groups in sufficient numbers that is not available in other sources. So we have, as mentioned earlier, ethnicity, traveller community, country of birth data, and detailed disability type, which has been really important for work in that area. And obviously also includes important information about outcomes. So there's no point in having the identifiers if we don't have the outcome measures as well. So just to summarise, some of the key strengths of that data is the disaggregation. So that's looking at disaggregated groups. So often in migration research, you often end up grouping countries together. So you might end up with having a category which is the rest of the world, and that actually includes groups which have very diverse experiences, that won't be reflected in a group like that. So another issue is around intersectionality, and this recognises the reality that people actually occupy very many different statuses and identities. So you might be disabled, but you also are you're also female, and you're also non-Irish. So it's when you start looking into intersectionality issues and how that affects your outcomes or discrimination, then you get into small numbers again. So the census has been one of the key sources there. Obviously, having the links between the individual and their household and what the characteristics of their household is crucial as well, because our economic and social outcomes are very much dependent on who we're living with as well. And I've mentioned there some of the outcomes that are in the census. The coverage and the quality of the data obviously is extremely high, and I think that is down to the extensive efforts of the enumerators and the CSO. So that means that we have been able to do research on groups like some of the hard to reach groups like the homeless population and traveller community. with the census. Also, this consistency over time. I mean, this is something that came up in the discussions earlier, so that the measurement is the same each year, unless there's very good reason to change it, and you know, that's not always the case with administrative data that you're gathering from different sources, and of course the small area information is also key. So in terms of the second main area of research that we're using the census for is around the demographic projections. So the ESRI, some of my colleagues produced national and regional demographic projections, and they're used in a whole range of research for policy. So that would be used in models of housing demand, healthcare demand, education, energy demand, and for the macro modelling. So it feeds into almost all of the areas. So that's just, these are again just an example of some of the recent studies. So one of them there is about looking at workforce projections for hospitals in Ireland. One is about housing demand. And the third one there is looking at demand for, that's early education and care. So looking at demand for the AIM programme, and that's work actually that we did with Pobal. So all of these are very reliant on the census and the demographic projections. So to give you, I'm just putting up here a graph. It wouldn't be an ESRI presentation without a graph. But this just is to illustrate the importance of a particular aspect of the data for the demographic projections, and that's the migration statistics. So that is the red line here. So basically, the main elements are your migration and then your natural increase, so your deaths and your births. But what's really driving the projections is the red line, is migration. The other is much more steady. And in Ireland, maybe this is where we differ from other countries as well, that migration is very volatile, so the numbers are very different over time, and the composition differs over time, so it changes rapidly. And also that group are really important for things like, because of their age profile, they're really important for projections around the labour market or housing, so it's really important we get that right. So the CSO produces the annual population migration statistics, and then they are reweighted when the census comes along every 5 years, and there's actually quite a big correction based on the census data. Because of this volatility. So I suppose there's a concern, I suppose, if we don't then have that check every 5 years and we have to wait for 10 years for the check to come, that there's an issue, about the accuracy of those estimates, and then that, as I say, feeds into all the other projections that we have as well. So just looking briefly then at the alternatives that are suggested. So the IPEDS, the administrative-based data obviously has a lot of key advantages. The cost, the frequency, the reduced respondent burden. So as I say, the key here is around for the demographic projections. The key need here is that we have these accurate estimates of the migrant population, and that these are, we don't need them necessarily every year, but we need to know that they're accurate and we can adjust them. For the, and I suppose this is where where the issue of around, does the administrative data have that information? Does it have, so we don't have, as John was mentioning earlier, country of birth is not in a lot of the admin data. So can we get that attached maybe to revenue data or DSP data? Then that might be able to meet that need. In terms of the equality analysis, so obviously some of the, and this is highlighted earlier in the CSO discussions, there's a lot of characteristics that aren't collected routinely in admin data, so ethnicity, the detailed disability data. At the moment, that the household and household attributes aren't in the EPIGs, but I understood that would be possible to add. So I suppose the other issue is around the outcomes and what outcomes we can include, because again, there's no point in having the characteristics without being able to link it to the outcomes. And I suppose this is where these might be sourced from the community survey or alternative places. So I think it would be crucial if there is going to be more reliance on the admin side, that there is then the community surveys or some other survey with sufficient numbers to plug those gaps. So in terms of the proposals, I think, yes, the mandatory element in terms would be certainly very useful in terms of addressing the lower response rates, which is something that is an issue across all primary survey research. Looking at the proposals in terms of the size in the CSO's papers, so the proposal is to have about 6,000 households per month, which would lead to about 72,000 households per annum. And I'm not sure if that's the case. So I just compare that to the LFS just to see what that meant in terms of sample size. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with using the LFS as well. So I mean, that has a I think the intended sample is 32,500 households per quarter. But the actual sample achieved is a bit lower, so about 12,500 households per quarter in 2023. So just based on experience of using the LFS data, that is a large enough sample, so the proposed sample would be large enough to look at a lot of the groups that we are interested in, so some disaggregation, but obviously it would still not be enough for some of the smaller groups. So I'm thinking maybe a group like the traveller community. So in this case, or maybe if you wanted to look at a particular nationality group, say if you wanted to look at Ukrainians or whatever. So there, I suppose, is an issue of if booster samples would be a possibility in those sort of cases. So if you identified some group that were not going to get enough cases, could there be booster samples to go along with a community survey? Again, now I think I may have got additional information from the earlier presentation that it's not going to be just of private households. That's what I understood from the paper. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's not an issue. So the idea would be to address communal households. So that would be really important. Yeah, and I suppose again just to reiterate that that we need to have the outcomes that are collected currently in the census and that are widely used that might not be available from somewhere else to match on. So I'm going to finish there because I think I'm running up against my time. But I just again would like to thank Anne and the group for giving me the opportunity to participate. So thanks all for listening.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you had told 19-year-old me doing past maths that I'd stand up in front of a room of probably at least half statisticians and talk about a structural equation model using confirmatory factor analysis, I probably wouldn't have believed it. So I'm not going to go too technical on any of it, largely because that would show up that I can't in front of this particular audience. So look, my name is Martin Quigley. I work with Pobal. We have I suppose the privilege of working with government departments in terms of rolling out programmes that are primarily aimed on social inclusion, but across areas such as early years and increasingly climate justice. My role within the organisation, does that go forward? Yeah, my role within the organisation is around supporting, utilising the administrative data that we have to better inform policy, to understand what's working, what isn't. But I suppose most importantly, what I'm going to be speaking about today is the fact that we commission and then I suppose curate and work with government departments around using the Pobal HP Deprivation Index. And I couldn't stand here and not mention, of course, the late great Trutz Haas, who I suspect would have loved to be here today and raised all sorts of annoyingly insightful questions on much of what we're talking about. So to go on and speak about the deprivation index, and won't labour the point too much, but I suppose as sort of an insight into how it does get very pragmatically and practically used on a day-to-day basis across government departments and state agencies. The deprivation index itself is a way of, I suppose, simplifying down that what was referenced as sort of the jewel in the crown, the small area data, which is a huge big data set of, is it 800 attributes and 18,919 rows, lots and lots of data. So we basically apply or work with Jonathan Pratchett, who applies a sociological definition, takes about 100 data points, synthesises those into 10 different attributes, and from that 3 different latent concepts. And at the result, at the end, we have one final score for each of the small areas in the country, and I'll show some of those now in a moment. But each of the 18,919 small areas will get a score from sort of -40 to about plus 30. You can see it's a quasi-normal distribution curve. So 70% of the population is marginally above or below. About 15% of the population will be disadvantaged, and 15% will be affluent. And it's a relative scale. So even if we all won the lottery tomorrow, there would still be about 15% of the population that would be regarded as living in areas classified as disadvantaged. It's available on Pobal Maps, so have a look if you haven't already. And it's the real value, and I'm going to speak to, is the fact that we have that community level information right down to small area, and are really able to understand which communities require additional services and additional investment. Using a definition which is effectively the absence of essential or desirable attributes, and not attributes, I suppose, separate to in the way we've been referring to it today, but attributes, possessions, or opportunity. So it's who you are, it's what you have, and it's where you are is what we look at. This is the structural equation model itself. You can see here the various points that are taken from census data, many of which I suspect could be replicated or could take information from administrative sources. It's not just individual information, though. It's individual information, it's household information, and it's also information about the area itself. So things like population change into or out of the area, which in particular in rural Ireland is a really useful and important way of understanding demographic vitality in an area. So again, some of this information is likely to be available from administrative sources. Some of it possibly could come from areas from things such as the ICS. However, we would need to then look at the level of geography at which we have that, because the real benefit is being able to aggregate all of this information to those 18,919 small areas. It gives us this, which is those small areas, colour-coded red being the most disadvantaged and blue being the most affluent. We typically see something that looks largely like this after every census wave, in terms of there being higher levels of disadvantage along the sort of the northwest coasts, and really the pockets of the most concentrated, both disadvantage and the most concentrated affluence, primarily in more urban areas. Probably the biggest change we've seen this year, with 2022 data that was published last year, is we've seen some of the most affluent areas according to our index, because those most affluent areas are in some of the new sort of commuter belt towns, because people moving in there are so homogenously managerial, professional, dual earning, very well qualified. So we're seeing that in an even more homogenous manner than in maybe the kind of the leafy suburbs that we would associate with more affluence. What levels does it work at? So it's created at the small area level, and then basically the larger the geographic unit, the more it just begins to tend to the mean. So yes, it is useful at ED or even LEA, but not nearly as useful as it is at the small area level. So just giving one practical example, I know we're shy on time. We don't usually go into naming particular communities. There's a risk in terms of labelling, etc. But I did think it was important today just to give one practical example of somewhere literally, a couple of 100 metres down the road, has been a fair bit of media attention in respect of Oliver Bond House in the last couple of weeks, in terms of things like the quality of the housing, the impact that has in terms of respiratory diseases, etc. And we've been having discussions with a number of government departments for the last couple of months since the index was generated, in terms of when the question comes up, where are the most disadvantaged areas in Dublin, this has jumped out. So this would have been the 2016 data. 2022, it's gone from being very disadvantaged to extremely disadvantaged. The characteristics of the small area haven't really changed. So there's 3 small areas there. That would be Oliver Bond House. The characteristics of the area haven't really changed, but the national average has. So because it's a relative index, it's fallen further from the national average. There's also been marginal population decline, which would also feed into a lower score. And I suppose one of the most important points that I would be making in terms of the benefit we get from the census data and having this information every 5 years at the small area level is that when you go from small area to electoral division, you end up with nothing. In terms of understanding deprivation, because we've taken the some areas that are increasingly gentrified here within just up in Dublin 8, right next door to Oliver Bond House, and averaged. And when we look at the average, it's marginally below average, minus 4.8. The last couple of minutes then just to say where it's used, and I suppose the importance then of having that information across a range of public policy areas. Within Pobal, we would support the Department of Rural Community Development around SICAP, LEADER, increasingly things like Just Transition, a number of other. But we would probably do maybe 10 or 12 resource allocation models a year for different departments. It's again widely used by the HEA and of course the Department of Education and Skills. Also really used by a lot of researchers. And one of the reasons that it doesn't include certain measures within its construction, which is important because it then allows us to analyse, well, how does deprivation relate to these other phenomena? So if we included health as a predictor of, as an input into deprivation, you couldn't then use the deprivation index in terms of comparing with health outcomes or in the health sphere. You'd fall foul of a tautology. I won't go into too much detail here on the health side, other than to say really interesting development at the moment, which is that we're working with the Department of Children around effectively recreating something similar enough to the DESH model, but for early learning and care, the equal participation model, which was announced in this budget. So another usage of the index coming up in that side. And then just one thing I was going to point to. So the image here on the left is, on the right, is taken from Health Atlas. And as I understand, speaking to Howard Johnson, one of the primary ways in which this weighting was constructed was, again, using census data on self-reported health, which basically allows us to understand from a resourcing perspective. It gives a weighting that says we can give every affluent area a relative weighting of 1, every average area a relative weighting of 1.43, and every disadvantage a relative weighting of 3, and use that to then multiply euros and cents in terms of things like investment. And then just to, and I suppose just to say as well, on the one on the left, this is the curve that we see time and time again when we look at the relationship between deprivation using those 10 census figures. We consistently see that curve in terms of a range of health outcomes. I believe this one is colorectal cancer, and shows the very strong relationship between between various forms of cancer and deprivation. I think it was a Cancer Registry Ireland found a 28% increased rate of people dying from a cancer diagnosis within 5 years if they were from the most disadvantaged area versus the most affluent. We found exactly the same thing when we mapped drug treatment. I won't go into the resource allocation model, but it's effectively just to say that we use the number of people living in disadvantaged areas as an input into how we calculate where money should go alongside population. And then there's a really important policy question of how much of this money should go on the basis of population versus on deprivation. And it's an important policy question around how targeted versus how universal is a programme. I won't go into the last, I'll just move on then to the final sort of concluding thoughts, which is to say, there's a huge, there's massive opportunities around the usage of existing data sets and administrative information that is out there. And I think, it has the potential to go a long way towards generating public trust if it's seen that actually the information that is given or that is given to the state through other arms is used in a way and isn't having to be asked for again and again. However, there are risks as well. Things like, I think we have a representative from Pave Point here, who, I would understand would say, of course, all state administrative data sets should be should have an ethnic identifier. But does that mean you can use that information to enumerate or estimate population, or should you be using that information to see, well, how well are state services targeting certain cohorts? And if it's that second purpose, well, then you need something to baseline it from in terms of an enumerated population. Of course, look, there is opportunities for much more timely information, and certainly from the perspective of the deprivation index, if there was, even if some of the factors that feed in could be updated on a more frequent basis, we could find a way to update, to use the census information that we have and keep that static, but then use updated information where that's available to update the index on a more ongoing basis. And of course, I suppose just from Pobal's overarching perspective, the potential to look at the equality, some form of equality impact assessment of these options, I think would be something that we would advocate as being very important. The primary, and look, I've made this point, so I won't labour too much anymore, but the primary point that we would be making from the perspective of the index and the options that are presented would just be around how do we ensure that there's, at least, we would be suggesting at least the same frequency of that attribute data that could come down to small area level, because without that, we just wouldn't be able to provide the kind of insights to government departments and state agencies that we can at the moment, and there's, there genuinely is really practical and tangible usage of it at the moment on a very regular basis. And I believe that's me. I've got some further reading on the conceptual model and technical description, which was written by Trutz, so I didn't even attempt to go into too much detail on it, but if you do want to, it's all up there. That's me. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very grateful to Anne Vaughan for inviting me to participate in this fascinating symposium, and to Brian Cahill for all kinds of help that I won't go into. I've learned a great deal from this morning's proceedings. This is nerd paradise. I mean, you all know each other. You're all nerds in communication. You know each other by your first names. It's just wonderful. I'm not a statistician or a mathematician or have any of the skills that have been displayed so beautifully by our various speakers this morning. Now, the CSO has a specific set of responsibilities in respect of census taking. We've heard about some of the challenges they're facing from new regulations and potential responses to those challenges. Their primary concern must be to collect and analyse data that will fulfil the needs of the users of the statistics derived from that data, statistics which form or should form the basis of government planning in a host of different areas. And I can't forbear to say this. I swore I wouldn't criticise the government this morning. I was going to be good. But when Helen Russell put up her slide saying, these are the areas of which the government makes use of the wonderful data collected by the CSO, every single one of them is in crisis. And if they had possibly looked at the wonderful data produced by the CSO over the years, we might not have such a bad housing crisis. We might not have hundreds of thousands of people waiting to get some health care. We might not be in a mess about childcare and so on. But that's the end of my rant. I'm just saying that I believe in the CSO as a shining light of accuracy and brilliance, and I wish other people would listen to them as much as the rest of us do. Now, the reports issued by the CSO also serve the purpose of enlightening our citizens as to who we are, how we're changing, and how we are living. So I'm here to be a nerd for both the past and the future. I had the privilege between 2007 and 2010 of putting the two earliest full surviving Irish censuses, those for 1901 and 1911, online free to access. What button do I press here? Oh, next. There we go. Is that working? Yes. I don't have a posh PowerPoint like all the other people because I no longer work for an organisation where I had a wonderful man who did all that stuff for me. Anyway, that's number one. We're going to this. So this is the search form for the 1901 and 1911 census websites, which I emphasise are available free to access. And although I fully and totally admire Jen and really love the information she gave us this morning, Britain makes you pay an awful lot of money for getting access to your historic census records. Not so in this great country. Now, you'll note the things that you can search by: name, location, occupation, religion, household position, literacy, marital status, country or county of origin, and ability to speak the Irish language. So we're in a unique position in relation to our census records in two respects. First, the level, can I just say that I learned something new this morning, which is that when we created that search interface, we were arranging for people to interrogate multiple attributes. I learned those words this morning. Attributes. Thank you, gentlemen, for that. The great men at the CSO who are just so fantastic in the stuff that they do. Many of you will know that we had census records. Cormac took us quickly through them this morning, from 1821 to 1891. The ones from 1821 to 1851 were destroyed in the fire in the Four Courts in 1922 at the beginning of the Civil War. I will not get started on that subject because I could go on for many hours in a rage of frustration about the fact that we no longer have, for example, the wonderful census records that both preceded and came after the Great Famine that would be of great use to us in all kinds of ways. The rest of them, in a way, more inexplicably, were lost through bureaucratic myopia, so I won't go into that either. Second, the census returns for 1901 and 1911 were open to the public in 1961, earlier than the practice, much earlier than the practice in other countries. And it must be said the sky didn't fall on our heads as a result of this audacious decision. The proximate reason for that, given at the time, is delightfully disingenuous. It's that those records were taken under the British administration, therefore we didn't have to abide by their rules now that we were an independent country. Hooray for hypocrisy. I have to say that the only complaint I have about the CSO, which I worship in every way, is that they might have thought about releasing the 1926 census a little bit earlier to coincide with the decade of centenaries, and we could have found out what things were like before from the 1911 census and what they were like afterwards from the 1926 census. But my former colleague, Zoe Reid, is here today from the National Archives. Great to see her, and I know that she is heavily involved in preparing that wonderful 1926 census for release in, I think, 2027, the 1st of January. Right. So roll on that date. I had one complaint from a citizen about the release of the census records online. One. There was one phone call, and a woman said to me, I do not like my information being up on that website about my ancestors. And I said, why not? And she said, I don't want every Tom, Dick and Harry finding out about my ancestors. So I said, well, Tom, Dick and Harry were coming into the Public Records Office in the Four Courts since 1961 and could have seen them any time. And she said, that's as may be, but you're making it easier for them now. So I told her she had to suck it up, that the whole country loved it, and she was going to have to live without it. So it was a no-brainer to put these records online because they were always the most popular records in the National Archives. The big change with online access was the capacity to search by name for the first time. Many people had been unable to find their ancestors because they didn't know where they were. You could search by location, but not by name, at the time that the original household returns were made. And the fact that we have the original household returns, which was filled out on census night by heads of households, brings the sympathetic magic of being able to see your ancestors' handwriting and signature, something very many people found extremely emotional. The Census website is the most popular cultural website in Ireland. When I left the National Archives in 2016, I always think 100 years back when I'm talking about this, so I tend to do 19 rather than 20. It had received 132 million hits in that year alone. I don't know what the stats are now, but they're remarkably high. The response from the public was and is overwhelmingly positive, even when unexpected information like previously unknown relatives, second wives, high levels of child mortality, and illiteracy emerge. People don't mind finding out embarrassing things about their ancestors. They just want to know who they were, where they were, what was going on. We actually have grown up a great deal, largely, I think, because we're now willing to democratize our archives and allow people to answer their own questions about their own families and ancestors. This also deepens our appreciation of history's complications and provides a valuable lesson in the nature of evidence and the difference between family lore and official documents, which is neither of those is exactly right, of course. Everything is biased, every piece of evidence you get, but you have to learn how to balance them. And an understanding of evidential process is more important than ever in this age of misinformation, disinformation, and crazy conspiracy theories being propagated on social media, which was dubbed the toilet of the internet by that great social commentator, Lady Gaga. And there she is to keep you all awake. A woman wearing a silver bodysuit is going to wake you up at any time. All of this valuable, satisfying, and enlightening stuff is possible because we have all of the original household returns for 1901 and 1911, a set of 9 million individual history capsules for each family. That value would be seriously diminished by sampling, thus doing away with the capacity for everyone to find their ancestors. And I suppose I'm here today to make a plea to keep, in whatever way the CSO deems it necessary, the traditional universal census so that everybody has a chance in 100 years' time to find, maybe less, maybe the CSO will just say, nah, we don't need to wait for 100 years, we'll bring it back to 75 like America. You could do that. So whenever, we'll all be dead, but whenever they start to go back and look for their information, it would be nice if they could look at everything that was there. And just 2 comments on what I've learned this morning as well. Cormac told us that we're going to move from, again, new terminology for me, de facto to usual residences. He can answer this question maybe later, but what happens to tourists staying in hotels? Do they have to say where they normally live? And, you know, we have a wonderful census return from 1911 for W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory staying in Nolan's Hotel in South Frederick Street on Abbey business in 1911. No hanky-panky going on, you may be quite assured. There was none of that. But it turns out that Yeats couldn't spell his own name. He put in an extra E, which wasn't supposed to be there. But we wouldn't, them giving Cool Park and wherever else Yeats was hanging out at the time as their addresses would not be any good to us in terms of a vital piece of information about. Anyway, I'm just putting that into your general thing there. The other thing is, nowadays when people are trying to find their ancestors, say Irish people living in America who know that their ancestors left sometime around the time of the famine, they go and look at the American census. And the census will say Charles Murphy or John Murphy left County Cork in 1847. That's no use. Cork is gigantic. Where in Cork? How many Murphys are there? Millions. If the census had asked to mention a lower denomination, and some people put it in themselves in the past, say the parish or wherever it is, what about our new communities who are coming from gigantic countries like India and China and Nigeria? What about their descendants years from now trying to find out, or their families back home in these countries, trying to find them in 75 or 100 years' time? Wouldn't it be better if we were able to say what province or what, bring it down a little bit? Again, I'm just putting that into the picture as something you might consider. I know Richie said we were to stay high level, but you can't. Really, the census is about the questions, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to look at what we can find now in the 1901 and 1911 census, what we can expect to find in 100 years if the next census follows the same system. I'm going to focus on 2 examples out of the many possible because I don't want to go over my time, which I'm still in danger of doing. So we have famous literary characters like James Joyce, Oliver St. John Gogarty, Sean O'Casey and Peg Sayers. Joyce left Ireland in 1904, as we all know, but he's living at home with his family in Royal Terrace in Fairview in 1901. And there he is looking dapper. When he was asked what he was thinking when that picture was taken, he said, I was wondering if the photographer would lend me £1. I wanted to go for a drink. Now, here's an actual census return, the excitement. Look, 1901, Royal Terrace, Fairview. The Joyce family, John Stanislaus Joyce, who appears in all of Joyce's novels, his wife May, he's 51, she's 39. Look at the number of pregnancies. Look at the ages of the children, 19, 17, 16, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. That woman was pregnant every year of her life. She dies 2 years later of cancer, and that death, of course, is hugely meditated upon in Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Joyce is there as a student. He is going to Newman's University in Stephen's Green. He and his brother, the long-suffering Stanislaus, who helped him all his life and got no thanks for it, both speak Irish and English because they were both in the Gaelic League at the time. You see a lot of people in cities talking Irish in 1911 because of that. You'll notice in the column for where born, we've got a bunch of children born in County Wicklow. That was when they moved down to Bray. The reason for that, given by Joyce's father, was that the train fare would keep his wife's relatives away. So there you go. We've got a vast amount of information there on that, and it's a crucial and wonderful thing, and very, very special. Then we have Oliver St. John Gogarty, who was the model for Buck Mulligan, there's a Joycean theme here, in Ulysses, famous novelist, writer, and doctor, of course, and who appears in Ulysses quite extensively. He's interesting because he forgot he was married. He's living in Ely Place. In the section for married, you can see there, he put in single and had to scratch it out and write in married above. We also see there were 3 little kids looking at him who had been there for 5 years. Anyway, that's what living too close to the Shelburne Hotel can do for you when you want to wander around there from Ely Place and have a drink and things go out of your head. Where are we now? Yes. Sean O'Casey, living in Abercorn Terrace in the East Wall, now an area of high social deprivation, or was. It's actually improving hugely at this point, Martin. He was there in 1911 with his mother Susan and his brother Michael. In 1901, he was playing John Casey. By the time we get to 1911, he's Sean O'Cohasig in the old Clog Gaelic, and he imposes the same Irish language restrictions on his mother and his brother, neither of whom spoke Irish. He's the only one who speaks Irish. Again, it's a Gaelic League situation. He's working as a labourer on the railway. They are a Protestant family in East Wall, which wasn't that unusual at the time. But you can see the poor enumerator going nuts and having to scrape out various things and writing over them what they are in English. They didn't like getting census returns in the Irish language. He's 12 years away from writing the first of his great Dublin trilogy, The Shadow of a Gunman. And lastly, in the literary coterie, we have, in a reverse linguistic manoeuvre, Peg Sayers, who was the bane of some of our lives at school with her autobiography in Irish, and she's to be found in the Great Blasket Island, where you'd expect to find her, but the entire form is filled out in English. Now, the Blasket Island was totally Irish-speaking in 1911 when this form was filled out. She is Margaret Guiheen, living there with her husband and many, many children. He's a fisherman. Everything's filled out in English because at that time people felt that the Irish language, which was drastically reduced, was no good to their children, that they should be speaking English. And also they felt when they were dealing with the state, it might be cleverer, as indeed it probably was, given what happened to Sean O'Casey's census return, to fill it out in English. In 100 years' time, what writers would we expect to find? Sally Rooney, our biggest literary star at present. She's very serious, Sally. It's hard to get a picture of her smiling. These are the burdens of writing great novels. John Banville, our great Booker Prize winner, getting on, but he's still writing great crime fiction. Anne Enright, yet another Booker Prize winner. Sebastian Barry, probably the most lyrical novelist at present. Would it not be a shame to deny our descendants the opportunity to discover their census returns and know what their domestic arrangements were? Now, snooping is part of the deal, okay? And why would it not be? We are entitled to be interested in snooping into the households of those who lived 100 years ago, particularly our own relatives. You see, everyone's in the same boat. You can look up so-and-so down the street who lived wherever it was 100 years ago and their neighbours, but they can do the same to you. So it actually is, I think it's part of an equalising process, Martin, that we could put into the mix. Another area that really, really matters, and this has come up this morning a number of times, is people marginalised by poverty. In Dublin in 1911, 26,000 families lived in tenement houses, 20,000 of those in single-room dwellings. And I skipped a thing here. Let me see if I can move on. I might have to move back. Yeah, I've lost some pictures there, but not to worry, we can survive without them. So, what we're looking at here is the census forms for both 1901 and 1911 have the original household returns, which are organised by street or townland, and for each street or townland you have 3 other forms. One, the N form, the enumerator's abstract, which tells you how many people lived on the street and what religious denomination they had. The B form, which is the most interesting, which tells you how many people lived in each house, in how many rooms in that house, and sometimes information about landlords, etc. And then the last one is for outhouses and farmsteadings, which is largely confined to rural areas. So this is the return for Buckingham Street in the North Inner City, number 13, and we can see that there are, let me just see, 8 households, 7 of them in single rooms, 1 or 2 room dwelling, 49 people altogether living there in 1911. Now, just to go back to where we were in the what was happening at the actual time, family size was very large at this period. Over a third of married women in 1911, 36% had 7 children or more. The death rate in Dublin per 1,000 was 22.3. In London, it was just 15.6. Childbirth was life-threatening for many mothers. Geographical location and social class were major determining factors in mortality. Babies born in urban areas were almost twice as vulnerable as those born in the country. The urban infant mortality rate was 150 per 1,000 live births. Rural mortality was 74. I'm very proud I have some statistics to give you. A baby born to a labourer was 17 times more likely to die within a year than the child of a professional. So here we are on Buckingham Street. That is the return for the street itself, which allows you to look at what class of house people were living in, how many rooms were in the house, and how many people were living in those rooms, how many households occupied the premises. So I told you there are 8 households. One of them was that of Marjorie and George Dixon, living with their 5 children in one room. George is 53, Marjorie's 48. He's a bricklayer, as is his eldest son, Joseph, who's 24. His other son, George Jr., is unemployed. 2 daughters, Bessie and Julia, 22 and 16 respectively, are laundresses, while 10-year-old Kathleen is a schoolgirl. There is also a nurse child or foster child, Thomas Power, living with the family. So even in a household with 5 children, most of them grown up except for Kathleen, 2 adults, they're taking in a foster child. And again, this is hard information to find. It's some of the stuff that goes missing. If we didn't have a names index to this data, we would never find Thomas Power. He would never, and his descendants would never find him. But the most devastating piece of information on this page is the detail of Marjorie's childbearing history. She's been married for 28 years. You can see this is a new question asked in 1911, to be answered by married women. How many years they were married, how many children they gave birth to, and how many survived. We can see that she gave birth to 13 children, but only 6 of them have survived. Now, it's very hard for us today to comprehend the suffering implied by such loss, or to relate to the coping strategies needed to get on with life. While the statistics on child mortality are stark and command our attention, this personal example of their meaning brings the human cost of them home in a way that the very useful numbers never can. We can imagine little Kathleen dealing with the deaths of brothers and sisters, and Marjorie herself having to keep going despite the decimation of her family. So I suppose what I'm saying is that individual household returns inspire empathy because we're looking at the records of real human beings who lived and died before us. Surely we should want to preserve that possibility going into the future, which may not be as bad-tempered and unempathetic as the present, but may of course be much worse. We can't predict that. In 100 years' time, will we be able to access the returns of families living in single-room hotels, arguably in worse circumstances than their counterparts 100 years ago? I had the privilege of living in a Georgian tenement myself for a while. Huge rooms, very hard to heat in the winter, but a lot better than a tiny hotel room for mother, father, and 2 kids. And God knows there are plenty of people living in those circumstances now. We need to know about that. We need to know about the statistics relating to it. In the future, we need to know who they were. We need to get that bang of empathy that we get when we look at Marjorie Dixon's census return. What about direct provision centres? What about, and it has come up time and time again, homeless people? And in terms of the fall in responsiveness that was described by all of you this morning, I'm assuming that the CSO does make contact with community groups in marginalised areas who are very good and trusted ambassadors to their own areas in terms of all of this. That can work, and likewise representative groups for migrant incomers who can again be a way of making contact. I know all this is really difficult and you have my sympathy. My plea is to preserve the system of gathering information from every household. Our descendants won't thank us for denying them the enlightening access to details about their ancestors that we enjoy today. Census records are the gold standard for genealogical research, and Ireland has a special reputation for making our returns free to access, thus allowing unlimited browsing on the site. Many other countries, including our dearest neighbour, as I said, charge money for access to census records, making searches quite expensive and prohibiting snooping, which in my view is a criminal activity. You should never prohibit snooping. We allow our citizens not just to find their own families, but to research their neighbourhoods and get a nuanced contextual view of life at the time. Finally, I want to make a plea for retention of the time capsule. It is such a great idea to let people write whatever they want about the time they live in. Even if a lot of them express hopes that Mayo has won the All-Ireland in the next 100 years, our descendants will get very rich material on what kinds of people we were. And I'll finish, if I have it, with a census return. That's George and Marjorie. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that you can put into the time capsule. This is the Cullen family in Blessington Street in Dublin in 1911. Robert Cullen lives with his wife and his upwardly mobile children, a seamstress, a typist, a bookbinding apprentice, and a junior clerk. Their married daughter is visiting them at the time. But there's one other member of the household, struck through by the enumerator, but still visible after 100 years on the bottom line here, and that is Tatters Cullen, their dog, who was 3 years old, born in County Longford, unmarried and unable to read or write. May everyone in 100 years discover the names of their ancestors' pets in the time capsule and the census returns, cheering us all up in the unimaginable future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catriona and Martin and Helen. Fabulous presentations about real people, and as I said, you saw each of their passion. I suppose Helen was talking about small groups of people who are marginalised. Martin was talking about people in small geographic areas, and Catriona was talking about people in our history. It's all about people. It's all about us. So we'll open up to questions. Because we're running a little short on time, I'll take all questions, and I might just ask my 3 CSO colleagues to join us, please. Yes, Francis.
Francis Rowan, formerly of the National Statistics Board. Can I just thank everybody for a terrific morning, which I didn't reply to that I was coming, but I was welcomed having crashed it this morning. I think one of the most important things about Catriona's talk, and it was wonderful, and we could feel everybody in the room's spirits lifting so much, but is it points to the fact that people connect with the census. And I think the fact that it goes online doesn't stop that connection, but it's the way we do that and the way the CSO continues to do it and not feel it's under threat. We want to feel it's something that we want to have and the CSO is delivering it, not that the CSO is putting a burden on us. So I think the whole language around how we talk about the upcoming census and the changes that are there really, really matters. I think if people realise that it's for them, that will be. I've just a couple of questions for different people along the way. I think the ONS experience, I think, gives us some grounds for optimism about the online responses. I hope we don't need a COVID or anything else to get them, but it is just makes you feel positively about what's happened. And I think I was struck by her continuum of users, and I was just wondering, does ONS have a strategy in relation to how it engages with that difference, that long one you had with the 2 circles, and what you're doing to get the kind of continuum of support among those users. Just struck me as I watched this morning that notion of how do we engage with children at school, because they're the future fillers inners of Census, and their notion of how they connect and know how this can be used about society and about their future selves, I think is important. The other thing that struck me, didn't come up this morning, was that, and I was wondering whether ONS has thought about it at all, is the potential for engaging with AI as things go down the road, in terms of embedding AI in such a way that people can actually make more use, who are not as expert, but if you like, along that continuum, who might be able to make safe use of it. Obviously, it would have to be done very carefully, but I'm just struck by that. I was struck by, in relation to Helen Russell's point, I think you can just see in that one graph was so important about the importance of migration to changing things. So that does point to, at a time of rapid change, having regular ways of estimating what migration is. But I do think it's also important, and it did come up in actually the ONS slide, is that the change in the age structure that's going on means that while the natural increase looks fairly not changing much, the reality is behind that natural increase is a lot of older people living longer, family sizes changing, etc. So I think that does matter. And final point really is that I think the really important thing about the census is, as a data set, it's the one that people immediately connect with place. And I suppose I have a hobby horse of many decades at this stage, that Ireland has had an unhealthy relationship in some sense with dealing with place. And I think one of the things that Pobal did and Truts did was actually pointing out that sometimes policy interventions based on place may be actually better ways of addressing issues than ones based on a broader social way of dealing with it. And we have the problem with spatial planning, where it really matters to us now as we try to plan better, to be able to have the data at the spatial level, at that micro level, so that people can actually use that better. And some terrific work has been done on that in recent times. So I just want to say thank you again for a terrific morning.
Thank you, Frances. Now, I think there was something there for everyone.
I'll be quick. So yes, definitely we want to build on that kind of the user personas and how we make data available. There were some really great innovations there that we really don't want to throw away. What underpins that is getting the data into the right shape and format to start with. And if you can do that, then these tools will sit on top, and it's actually a kind of a cheaper and more straightforward way for us to make data available as well. So definitely pushing that kind of innovation and dissemination. The schools point is a really interesting one, and what we did in England and Wales was, in the run-up to the census, we had a schools competition where each of the schools would do a project using census data from the past, to answering whatever questions they want. And then the winning school in England and the winning school in Wales were where we announced the first results. So I was at a primary school in Wales saying, ta-da, here's the population of Wales, and all the media were there, and similarly in England. So that was kind of one way of really, I guess part of the thinking is, if the kids say to the parents, you've got to fill in the census questionnaire, the parents might be more likely to do it as well. But yeah, that engagement with the schools was fantastic, and is something that we'll look to keep building on.
Yes, just on the other demographic changes, I mean, I think that's right, Frances, that there's lots going on underneath that as well, and in terms of household size and things like that are important. I suppose with something like ageing, or with fertility or something like that, I suppose the key thing is that's much more slow changing, so it's easier to predict over time. So it's not like it would be very unusual that within a couple of years that there would be a big change in birth rates or whatever. So I suppose it's the volatility of the migration piece that makes it that makes the underlying data much more important, I suppose.
I suppose just to come on the point around the whole concept of sort of place-based approach to intervention and services and approaches, it is that point that individual disadvantage concentrates and comes together, and then that results in another form of added disadvantage in terms of things like social capital and as the examples we've seen there, the impacts that there can be in terms of even just things like housing and everything that flows through with that. So the approach that yeah, understanding at the very small, micro-geographic level, are there these concentrations, these pockets of real concentrated disadvantage, and being able to target that on quite an agile basis, because, there'll be a lot of areas that will stay the same, but at the really micro level, there's actually a lot of change as well. So being able to understand that on as frequent a basis as possible is really important for that whole ethos of place-based approaches to interventions and services.
Catriona or our CSO friends?
Well, I suppose just to one of the issues that Francis raised was the idea of trust and how people relate to the census. And the idea of children, Jen just mentioned, children can be great drivers in their households. There's nothing like a bossy teenager who's fallen in love with the whole climate change movement to drive their families crazy, but make them do things. And the same could apply with the census. I would try to use the historic census in a way as a motivational tool that you can say to people, this is not just for you and for the state to get information which it may or may not act on, but it is for the future. Your descendants, if you have any, and you won't if you go on the way you're going, you don't say, will be looking for this in 100 years, 75 years' time, whenever it is. Just fill it out for that reason and send that nice message into the future that you put your name and information down and wrote something in the time capsule so that people can have a wonderful day very far into the future. It's worth a try.
Tim.
So thanks to everyone, and thanks for the wonderful presentations as well. I suppose if there's one specific point just to address to move on to the concept of place, is just in terms of, say, the IPEDS product, we will have the ability to produce, probably at higher frequencies, many of the key indicators for deprivation variables. Now, there will be complications, there will be trade-offs, but we will have the ability to, for example, with our air code coverage, as it gets better and better, we will have a very strong picture of household composition and lots of key variables. And I think the idea of the combination of that as well, plus obviously all options are on the table, but the idea certainly is the IPEDS product in itself would provide a lot of the key elements. Now, again, so I suppose that's one takeaway. I suppose one other thing I would add as well is then in terms of just the Irish Community Survey as well, that it would provide an opportunity, especially 70,000 households, say, on an annual basis doesn't sound that much. But if we pool together, say, 3 years' worth of figures, and say we pool it together, say, 5 years' worth of figures, we'll have actually very detailed statistics at a 3-year level. We'll have very detailed statistics at a 5-year level. So what we offer is greater frequency. The other thing as well is because it's customizable, we do have the ability to say if specific questions come up, say mid-census cycle, we can add these questions in. So we have the possibilities of, we will gain a lot of information if we run with these approaches as well. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Emily Mannion, Royal College of Surgeons. I think there's been a constant theme of trust and buy-in and how the census is so respected and valued within Ireland. And I'm wondering with IPEDS and taking a step back with the data collection, like we would provide information to the Higher Education Authority every year, which would then probably feed in and into the college students' information you're using. If we're trying to collect more information from there, do we run the risk of people sort of not buying into it because they're wondering why do you need this information to provide to this, state body, which then feeds into the CSO, and whether it's going to sort of break that trust, because people don't want to give that information maybe because they're wondering, well, why do you need it?
I'll take a few more questions and then if there are any. Sorry, yes.
Granular, Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Use. I'm wondering how you're going to decide between the options. What's the decision-making process? I mean, I know for me, I want all of them. I want a fire census every 5 years, IPEDS and the community survey. How are you going to decide about this group? I imagine pretty much would vote for that, but we're not the population and we're not what Ireland might choose.
Okay. Any other questions in the hall? No. Okay. And I'll throw one in. from behind us here. How to manage public perception of CSO if frequency of surveys increases? Is there a risk of Big Brother? Okay, so we'll take the questions we've heard. Richie, do you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe if I come back on the question around, say, the HEA example. I think it's an administrative data source, and it is collected for administrative purposes. And any information then that the CSO uses to produce statistics, certainly, look, we have the legally, we've got the national and EU basis for using that information. We've got rigorous data governance procedures in place around the use of that data, around security, confidentiality, anonymisation of the data. So I think we can reassure kind of people who provide data to the HEO around the social acceptability of the use of that data to produce population statistics. So I think that's important. And on a broader level around the kind of use of administrative data, the CSO, from a data stewardship perspective, we went out to government and public authorities, and we encouraged the use of the unique identifiers, the PPSN, the AIR code. But more recently now, we're going out to the public authorities and looking at the kind of how they're collecting, the types of questions they're asking, how they're asking the questions, to try and improve them across the system. So we look at one government department might collect data on marital status with a list of 3 categories. Others might provide a list of 4 categories. But in the census, we have a kind of an agreed set of questions for collecting data on marital status. So we try to encourage kind of more use of the common set of questions and classifications around the system, which ultimately will benefit the likes of IPEDs and that. So, and we're engaging on a regular basis with all kind of government agencies and departments who collect data, and ultimately it will lead to the improvement of the types of administrative and blended data outputs that we use.
Okay. Would you like to say something just about the process from here? You mentioned it earlier, but just to Grania's point.
Yeah, from here, I suppose, look, we've got a lot of feedback, you know, from the floor and through the Slido, and we'll reflect on that feedback, and we'll prepare a paper for public dissemination, probably in the second half of the year, and we'll invite a kind of a written and online submissions, and look, we'll have to reflect on that feedback from the various stakeholders, the kind of key users like yourselves and the general public at large, other government departments, and we just have to collate that feedback and reflect on you know what the society's view is.
Yeah, and everything is a balance in the end.
Yeah, like ultimately it's the kind of decision of the Director General of the CSO as to how population and demographic statistics are compiled, but certainly we'll listen to the views, you know, during the public consultation.
Yeah. And this, as I say, today is only the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I think we're putting it up online as well, so that people can see it and engage with it. And, you know, there is you heard from the CSO people, there is a huge amount of planning in any changes. So it is a long way off in one way, but we need to plan for the future. Before I wrap, can I invite our panellists, any or all, who would like to say any concluding comments or anything on what was raised? Helen, you look like you're going to say something.
I was just going to say I agree with Grania. I want all of the above.
Yeah.
I think that was probably the overriding response we got to our consultation as well. We'll have everything, please, which would be exactly what I said. But unfortunately, it's all got to be paid for as well. So. but just say it has been, from my perspective, a really fantastic event, and really reassuring to see that we are all facing the same sorts of issues, but tackling them in a very similar way as well. There's nothing here that it looks like any of us have missed, and it's great to be able to learn from each other through this period of change as well.
Thanks, John. Martin?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the questions were centering around, and I think just, you know, the most important currency within all of this is public trust, and it's leveraging and maintaining that emotional connection that we have with the census as it exists at the moment, and making sure that that doesn't get lost in sort of a perceived move towards a more technocratic approach. And I think finding that balance will be really important as we bring in new technologies and, you know, move with the times, but trying to maintain that connection, because it is what, you know, what drives engagement and what drives trust.
Just a side thing, I'm obsessed with the time capsule, as I made clear. I think about 22% of people filled it out. Is that right, Cormac? Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me if in a few years' time you start to get a movement of people who took pictures of their time capsule on the form and start to put them online. And then we'll all get to see what they put in long before the 100 years are up. This is a sideways way of saying, do away with the 100-year rule and open things up faster. It was a wonderful day. I've learned so much from being here. I think, you know, the state can be very unfairly criticised in some ways, including by myself sometimes. But the CSO is doing a tremendous job, and it was so interesting to hear how you're tackling all of these challenges and how devoted you are to the census. Like, people need to be devoted to these extraordinary things that we can do, and that really impressed me today. So thank you so much, all of you.
Oh, thank you. Just some very short wrap-up comments from me, but just because I don't want to leave it hanging there. Will there be political involvement in the final decision, etc., etc.? Just to say, as part of this process, we will be presenting to the Joint Oireachtas Committee in due course, and we want to let this process run a little bit, but we have been in contact with them, and you know, it would be, any organisation would be very foolish to make a decision in isolation, and there will be nothing like that done. This is, as I say, very much an open and ongoing consultation. So I hope that's clear. So just some very quick thanks to our speakers and our fine chairpersons. Really well done, much appreciated. And as I say, it's a great start. So that's good. To yourselves for coming today and engaging. Brilliant. When you're sort of discussing the things, you're wondering, what if nobody asks questions? But we don't have that problem. I hope you found it useful, interesting. We certainly did, and we have note takers, and we obviously have a record, and we'll be working our way through it. As I said, in a few days we'll put everything up on our website, nsb.ie. Thanks to those behind the scenes who made today happen. As I always say at these kind of events, they don't just happen all by themselves. So I'd like to thank Ken Kennedy, John Byrne, Dave Lester and their teams in Cork, the CSO staff in Swords, home of the census, and the CSO staff in Rathmines who helped. Thanks to the OPW people here in Dublin Castle and to Brambles Catering. And finally, huge thanks to Brian Cahill, who's Secretary to the NSB, for putting today together, liaising with everybody, keeping me on track, no small job. I hope the rest of your day goes well. Safe travelling to all of those, of course, who are going to the real capital, and enjoy the rest of St. Bridget's Day. Thank you very much.